The fluorescent lights of the supermarket buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow across the aisles as Emily Carter maneuvered her cart with deliberate care. She'd slipped away from the suffocating demands of her high-stakes world, craving the simplicity of a task as basic as grocery shopping. The air smelled faintly of baked bread and overripe fruit, a comforting hum of normalcy she hadn't experienced in years. Her fingers brushed the cool glass of a bottle of olive oil, and for a fleeting moment, she felt a quiet satisfaction until the shrill wail of an alarm shattered the peace. Conversations halted, heads swiveled, and the mundane rhythm of the store ground to a jarring stop. Emily's heart gave a slight jolt, though her face remained composed. She assumed it was a glitch, a false alarm triggered by someone else's oversight. But then she saw him, a store employee, striding toward her. His steps clipped and his expression tight with suspicion. "Excuse me, ma'am," he barked, his voice cutting through the growing murmurs of the crowd. His eyes flicked to the olive oil nestled in her cart, narrowing as if he'd caught her red-handed. "I need to talk to you about that." Emily tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her tone steady but laced with a trace of curiosity. She wasn't used to being questioned like this here, not in a place where she'd sought anonymity. The employee jabbed a finger toward the bottle. "That item wasn't scanned. Were you planning to just walk out with it?" His words carried an edge of accusation, sharp enough to sting. Her lips parted in disbelief, a flicker of incredulity sparking behind her calm exterior. "I haven't even been to the checkout yet," she replied, her voice firm but measured, each word chosen with care. "I literally just put it in my cart." The man's face twisted into a smirk, skepticism dripping from his tone. "Really? The alarm says otherwise. Step aside, please." His volume rose just enough to draw eyes from across the aisle, and Emily felt the weight of attention settle over her like a shroud. She glanced around, noticing the shoppers who'd paused mid-aisle, their carts abandoned as they craned their necks to watch. A woman clutching a bag of apples whispered something to her teenage daughter, who nodded with wide-eyed agreement. An older man in a faded jacket shook his head, his lips pursed in silent judgment. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of assumptions weaving through the crowd. "Thief, shoplifter." Caught her in the act. Emily's chest tightened, not from fear but from the absurdity of it all. She straightened her spine, refusing to shrink under their gazes. "I don't understand," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs with quiet authority. "This has to be a mistake." Before she could elaborate, a new voice barged into the fray, a burly man in his late 50s. His baseball cap tilted back to reveal a weathered face flushed with self-righteous indignation. "I saw her," he bellowed, jabbing a thick finger in her direction. "Back there, acting all sneaky, like she was hiding something. Don't let her fool you." Emily turned to him, her calm faltering for a split second as surprise flashed across her features. "That's not true," she countered, her tone sharpening with resolve. "I was just shopping." The man sneered, his lip curling as he leaned closer, his breath sour with coffee and disdain. "Don't play innocent with me. You think you're better than everyone else, all dressed up like that? I know what I saw. You were gonna steal it." The words landed like a physical blow, igniting a spark of anger deep within her. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced it down, her years of navigating boardroom battles lending her an unshakable poise. The employee, emboldened by the man's outburst, stepped closer, his arms crossing over his chest in a show of authority. "Ma'am, if you've got nothing to hide, you won't mind waiting while we figure this out. Put the cart down and come with me." Emily drew a slow, deliberate breath, her hands resting lightly on the cart's handle as she met his gaze. "I have nothing to hide," she said, her voice low and unwavering, "because I've done nothing wrong. If you check your cameras, you'll see I picked up that bottle and placed it in my cart, no more, no less." Her composure seemed to rile him further. His jaw tightened, and he snapped, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." The crowd pressed in, their curiosity morphing into something uglier, judgment fueled by assumption, their whispers now a low roar. Meanwhile, across town in the sleek, glass-walled offices of Resolve Tech, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. Emily's absence hadn't gone unnoticed. In a conference room lined with polished oak and framed awards, A storm brewed among the company's stakeholders. Richard Gray, a grizzled investor with a penchant for confrontation, slammed his fist onto the table, the impact sending ripples through the water glasses. His face was a mask of frustration, his voice booming with barely contained fury. "This is spiraling out of control, Emily. You can't keep pouring money into these bleeding heart projects while the company stalls. We're here to make a profit, not to play savior." The room hummed with agreement, a ripple of nods and grim expressions spreading among the suits seated around the table. Patricia Lang, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for cutting through nonsense, leaned forward, her arms crossed tightly. "With all due respect, Emily, we can't afford your long-term vision right now. Our competitors are eating us alive. If we don't shift focus, there won't be a company left to save anyone." Emily sat at the head of the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a study in restraint. Inside, a tempest of frustration churnaged fought this battle before, over and over, with people who saw numbers instead of lives. "Resolve Tech isn't just another corporation," she said, her voice steady but laced with steel. "We're building technology that transforms healthcare, that reaches people who've been left behind. That's our purpose: serial, lasting change." Gray's face reddened, his chair creaking as he leaned closer. "And what about the shareholders? The ones who bankrolled this purpose of yours? Good intentions don't fill bank accounts. We're losing ground to companies who aren't distracted by your charity stunts." The word charity hung in the air like a curse, drawing murmurs of approval from the others. Emily's jaw clenched, but she held her ground. "This isn't charity," she shot back, her tone firm and unyielding. "It's strategy. Every dollar we invest in healthcare access builds our reputation, expands our influence, and strengthens our future. We're not chasing quick wins, we're creating something enduring." Patricia's lips thinned, her voice cool but pointed. "Enduring won't matter if we collapse under the weight of your ideals. We need results now, not promises." The room fell into a heavy silence, thick with dissent. Emily rose, her movements deliberate, her voice cool as she addressed them. "I hear your concerns. I'll consider them." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and left, the murmurs swelling behind her like a rising tide. Alone in her office, she leaned against her desk, exhaustion seeping into her bones. The weight of their demands pressed down on her, relentless and unforgiving. She needed a break, not a surrender, just a moment to breathe. That's when the idea struck, a grocery run, a chance to step into a world where no one knew her name. Back in the supermarket, the situation spiraled further. Two police officers arrived, their boots thudding against the linoleum as they approached. The taller one, Officer Daniels, a man with a stern jaw and tired eyes, scanned the scene with practiced detachment. His partner, Officer Reese, younger and eager, cracked his knuckles, his gaze locking onto Emily with suspicion. "What's going on here?" Daniels asked. His tone clipped. The employee jumped in, his voice brimming with confidence. "Caught her trying to walk out with that olive oil. She's denying it, but the alarm went off, and this guy saw her acting shady." He nodded toward the baseball cap man, who puffed out his chest, relishing his moment. "I wasn't walking out," Emily said, her patience fraying, but her voice still controlled. "I hadn't even reached the checkout. This is a misunderstanding." Reese smirked, stepping closer. "That's what they all say. Hands behind your back, let's sort this out at the station." Emily's eyes widened, a surge of disbelief coursing through her. "You're serious?" "I didn't steal anything." Daniels sighed, rubbing his temple as if he'd rather be anywhere else. "Ma'am, just comply. It'll be easier for everyone." The crowd watched, rapt, as Reese pulled out handcuffs, the metal glinting under the harsh lights. Emily's mind raced years of commanding boardrooms, of bending the world to her vision, and now this, reduced to a spectacle over a bottle of olive oil. She complied, her wrists cold against the steel, but her spirit burned with quiet defiance. As they led her away, the whispers followed, a cacophony of judgment blind to the truth. No one at the officers, not the employee, not the gawking onlookers knew who she was. Emily Carter, billionaire philanthropist, tech visionary, a woman who'd reshaped industries, now stood humiliated in a supermarket aisle. The irony was bitter, but the lesson cut deeper. Justice could be blind, but so could prejudice. and power misused left scars no wealth could erase. In the fluorescent-lit chaos of the supermarket aisle, the employee's hand darted toward Emily's cart with a ferocity that caught her off guard. His fingers wrapped around the bottle of olive oil, yanking it free in a motion so swift and forceful it bordered on hostility. Emily's instincts kicked in, her hands tightening around the cart's handle as she pulled back, her knuckles whitening under the strain. For a fleeting moment, they were locked in a silent tug-of-war, the bottle swaying precariously between them, a symbol of something far greater than its contents. "Let go," the employee snapped, his voice rising with each syllable, sharp and jagged like a blade slicing through the air. Emily's heart thudded, but she held her ground, her resolve fraying at the edges. "This is ridiculous," she fired back, her voice trembling slightly as the calm facade she'd so carefully maintained began to crack. "I'm not letting you accuse me of stealing something I haven't even paid for yet." The brief scuffle rippled outward, drawing curious glances from nearby shoppers. A small crowd materialized almost instantly, as if summoned by the tension in the air. Phones slipped from pockets, their screens glowing like tiny beacons as onlookers began recording, their whispers weaving a web of judgment around her. "Unbelievable," one voice muttered, low and disdainful. "She thinks she's above it all." Another hissed, the words landing on Emily like a sudden, stinging blow. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to release the cart, stepping back with deliberate slowness. She raised one hand slightly, palm open, a quiet signal that she wasn't fighting through her eyes, locked on the employees, burned with an unyielding intensity. "This is absurd," she said, her voice dropping to a steady, controlled timbre despite the storm brewing inside her. "I'll pay for my items at the checkout," just as I intended to from the start. But the employee wasn't swayed. His face hardened, a flicker of triumph glinting in his eyes as he reached for the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. "We have a shoplifting incident in progress," he barked into the device, his tone clipped and authoritative as he requested backup. Emily's stomach twisted into a knot, a cold wave of dread washing over her. The situation was slipping beyond her grasp, spiraling into something unrecognizable. She could feel the weight of the crowds staresome curious, others openly hostile leering into her like needles. A man in a faded baseball cap, his arms crossed smugly over his chest, spoke up, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "That's right. Call the cops. Let's see her talk her way out of this one." His words were a taunt, a challenge thrown into the air for all to hear. Emily turned to face him, her composure fracturing just enough for a flash of raw emotion to break through. "Do you have any idea how damaging false accusations like this can be?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs. The man shrugged, his indifference a slap in the face. "All I know is what I saw." Moments later, two more employees arrived, their footsteps heavy against the tiled floor. Their faces were stern, etched with the kind of no-nonsense determination that suggested they'd already made up their minds. One of them, a weary man with a clipboard clutched in his hand, glanced at Emily before sweeping his gaze over the growing crowd. "What's going on here?" he demanded. The first employee wasted no time, launching into a dramatic retelling of events, his voice thick with accusation as he painted Emily as a cunning thief trying to slip out unnoticed. Each word twisted the truth further, and Emily stood there, her frustration simmering beneath her skin like a fire she couldn't extinguish. When he finally paused, she stepped forward, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "That's not what happened. I placed the olive oil in my cart and was going to pay for it. This is all a misunderstanding." But her words seemed to dissolve into the air, ignored by the new arrivals. The weary employee reached for his own walkie-talkie, his tone final as he muttered, "Calling law enforcement." Emily's breath caught, her heart pounding against her ribcage. This wasn't just about a bottle of olive oil anymore. It was about trust shattered, assumptions weaponized, and the bitter taste of injustice creeping in. The crowd's murmurs swelled, snippets of their conversations slicing through the tension. "Looks like she's trying to weasel her way out," one woman said, her voice laced with suspicion. "She's to come definitely guilty," another added, as if Emily's restraint were proof of some hidden crime. "Or maybe she's just entitled." A third chimed in, the word dripping with disdain. Emily closed her eyes for a heartbeat, drawing a slow breath to steady herself. Losing her temper wouldn't undo this mess, it would only fuel their narrative. When she opened her eyes again, she caught the gaze of a young woman in the crowd. Her phone held steady as she recorded. Unlike the others, her expression wasn't one of condemnation. There was a flicker of something softer, sympathy, perhaps, or a quiet disbelief at the absurdity unfolding before her. Their eyes held for a moment, a fleeting connection Emily couldn't fully process before the wail of sirens pierced the air. The crowd parted reluctantly as two police officers strode into the store, their presence commanding instant silence. The lead officer, a tall man with a square jaw and a demeanor that brooked no argument, scanned the scene with practiced efficiency before settling his gaze on Emily. "We got a call about a shoplifting incident," he said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "Can someone explain what's going on?" The first employee jumped in, gesturing wildly toward the olive oil and Emily's cart as he repeated his accusations. With renewed vigor, the officer listened, his face a mask of neutrality, before turning to Emily. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step outside while we sort this out." Emily squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I haven't stolen anything," she said, her voice even but laced with an undercurrent of defiance. "I intended to pay for everything in my cart." "This is a mistake." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, a younger man who shifted his weight uncertainly. "We'll figure that out," the older one replied, his tone curt. "But for now, step outside." As Emily moved toward the exit, flanked by the officers, the crowd's eyes followed her like a spotlight she couldn't escape. Some looked on with pity, their faces softened by doubt. Others stared with cold judgment, their lips curled in disapproval. A few seemed almost gleeful, relishing the drama of her downfall. Her hands remained steady, but inside, her heart hammered against her chest. A relentless Edison's words echoed in her mind. Years of navigating adversity had taught her. One crucial lesson: panic solved nothing. She felt the weight of those years now, the memories flooding back as the officers led her into the parking lot. Under the harsh glare of the supermarket lights, she could still hear the whispers trailing behind her, shadowy and relentless. But she kept her face impassive, her posture rigid. This wasn't the first time she'd been unfairly targeted, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Years earlier, in the heart of Oakland, a younger Emily had sat in the dim corner of her middle school classroom, her head bowed over a math textbook. The numbers and equations were her refuge, a world where logic reigned and her sharp mind could shine without the weight of others' resentment. She was the brightest in her class, the only kid from her block to earn a full scholarship to a prestigious private high school. But instead of pride or celebration, her success bred envy. One humid afternoon, as she walked home clutching a new backpack, a gift from her mother to mark her achievement, heard footsteps behind her. 3 classmates, their laughter jagged and cruel, closed in. "Think you're better than us, huh?" Carter, one of them, a boy with a chipped front tooth, jeered. Emily quickened her pace, her pulse racing, but they were faster. Before she could escape, the boy grabbed her backpack, yanking her off balance. "Scholarship kid doesn't need this, does she?" he sneered, unzipping it and dumping its contents onto the cracked sidewalk. Her books and notes spilled out, fluttering in the breeze as she dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather them. Maybe if she didn't act so stuck up, she'd have real friends, another said, shoving her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble. The third, a weary girl with a smirk, kicked Emily's books into the gutter, their pages soaking in the murky water. The trio walked off, their laughter ringing in her ears as she sat there, fighting the tears burning her eyes. After a long moment, she rose, salvaged what she could, and carried the damp, ruined pages home. That night, in their cramped living room, her mother found her painstakingly drying each page with a towel, her small hands trembling with suppressed rage. "Why didn't you fight back?" her mother asked, her voice a mix of worry and exasperation. Emily looked up, her dark eyes steady despite the ache inside her. "Because if I do, I'll be the one who gets in trouble," her mother sighed, a sound heavy with unspoken truths, and didn't press further. Even then, Emily had understood a harsh reality, in a world quick to judge her by her skin. Her address, her very existence, Composure was her shield, her strength. Now, standing in the supermarket parking lot, that same resilience steadied her. The officers' questions came fast, their voices clipped, their stances rigid. "Ma'am," the older one said, flipping open a notepad, "we were told you attempted to shoplift. Is there any reason you didn't pay for the item in question?" Emily met his gaze, unflinching. "As I've already explained, I hadn't reached the checkout yet. Everything in my cart was going to be paid for. This is a misunderstanding." The younger officer shifted, his brow furrowing slightly. But his partner remained unmoved. "The employees are pretty adamant," the older one said. "And we've got witnesses saying you look suspicious." Emily's patience wore thin, though she kept her tone level. "Suspicious how? By placing items in my cart like every other shopper?" Before they could respond, the store manager swaggered over. His chest puffed out with self-righteous confidence. "We've dealt with this before," he said, his voice oily with smugness. "These types always think they can talk their way out of it." Emily's jaw clenched at the insinuation, but she refused to rise to the bait. "I'd appreciate it," she said, her words deliberate and icy, "if you'd refrain from making baseless assumptions about types." The manager ignored her, turning to the officers. "The security footage will back us up. She didn't skin the item, it's as clear as day." Emily opened her mouth to protest, but the younger officer cut in, hesitant. "Can we review the footage now, sir?" he asked, glancing at his partner. "Later." The older one snapped, his tone dismissive. "Let's get her ID first." Emily handed over her driver's license without a word, though the indignity of it gnawed at her. As the officers examined it, fragments of the crowd's chatter drifted over. "She looks too calm," a woman said, her voice suspicious. "If she were innocent, wouldn't she be more upset? Maybe she's used to getting away with it." Another replied, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. Emily's fists clenched at her sides, but she forced herself to focus. "I'm cooperating fully," she said, her voice rising above the whispers, "but I'd like this resolved quickly. I have no intention of standing here being humiliated for something I didn't do." The manager smirked. "Funny how you're suddenly in a rush to leave." Emily turned to him, her gaze like tempered steel. "I have nothing to hide, but I won't be treated like a criminal without cause." The older officer cut in, holding up her ID. "Everything checks out, but we'll still need to detain you while we investigate further." Emily's heart sank, disbelief threading through her voice. "Detain me? On what grounds? It's protocol," he replied curtly. Pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt, she took a step back, her composure slipping as the cold metal glinted under the lights. For the first time, she felt the weight of it all: accusations, the stares, the assumption of guilt threatening to crack the armor she'd spent a lifetime forging. In that moment, the lesson of justice burned clearer than ever. Power, unchecked, could twist truth into a weapon, leaving the innocent to bear its scars. Emily's story wasn't just hers, it was a mirror to a world where consequences often fell hardest on those least deserving. A stark reminder that the line between right and wrong could blur under the weight of authority misused. The air outside the supermarket was thick with tension, a simmering heat that seemed to rise from the cracked pavement and mingle with the murmur of the gathering crowd. Emily stood there, her shoulders squared, her dark eyes flashing with a mix of defiance and disbelief. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Sharp and unyielding, her tone carried the weight of someone who had been pushed too far, someone who refused to bend under the pressure of an unfair accusation. She could feel the sting of judgment in the stares around her, as though the onlookers had already branded her guilty without a shred of proof. The younger officer, a lanky man with a face still softened by inexperience, shifted uneasily on his feet. His eyes darted between Emily and his partner, a flicker of doubt clouding his expression. "Maybe we should check the footage first," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the growing hum of the crowd. He tugged at the collar of his uniform, as if the fabric itself was tightening around his conscience. He didn't want to be here, didn't want to be part of this unfolding scene. But he was tethered to the older officer's authority, a rookie caught in the shadow of protocol. "Protocol," the older officer barked, his voice a low growl that brooked no argument. He was a broad-shouldered man, His face weathered by years of enforcing rules he no longer questioned. His certainty was unshakable, a wall of conviction built brick by brick over decades on the job. Before Emily could protest further, he snapped the handcuffs around her wrists with a swift, practiced motion. The cold metal bit into her skin, a sharp, unyielding reminder of her sudden loss of freedom. She winced, her breath catching for a moment, but she pressed her lips into a tight line, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a complaint. The crowd's whispers swelled into a chorus of murmurs, a chaotic symphony of curiosity and condemnation. Emily's gaze swept over them, catching on a young woman near the edge of the group. She was holding up her phone, recording the scene with trembling hands, her face a storm of emotion, sympathy, perhaps, or a quiet fury at what she was witnessing. Unlike the others, whose eyes glinted with judgment or idle fascination, this woman seemed to see Emily, truly see her, as more than just a spectacle. Their eyes locked for a fleeting second, a silent exchange of understanding, before the older officer's firm grip on Emily's arm pulled her toward the patrol car. As she slid into the back seat, the door slamming shut behind her with a dull thud, Emily leaned against the hard, unforgiving surface of the seat. The chill of the vinyl seeped through her blouse, grounding her in the reality of the moment. Her mind churned, not with panic, but with a heavy, sobering clarity. This wasn't just about a bottle of olive oil and absurd misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. No, this was about something far deeper, the swift hand of judgment, the insidious creep of prejudice, and a system that too often crushed people beneath its weight before bothering to seek the truth. The handcuffs clinked faintly as she shifted her hands, the sound a cold, metallic echo of her predicament. Outside, the crowd pressed closer to the supermarket's glass doors, their voices a tangle of opinions. Some craned their necks, eager for a better view, while others muttered darkly under their breath. "Ma'am, step this way," the older officer commanded, his fingers digging into Emily's arm as he steered her toward the car. His grip was firm, unyielding, a physical manifestation of his belief in her guilt. "I can walk on my own," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor of frustration running through her. She tugged her arm back slightly, a small act of resistance, but he ignored her, his hand tightening instead when she pulled harder, his patience frayed like a worn rope snapping under strain. With a sudden jerk, he yanked her forward, sending her stumbling to the ground. The pavement rushed up to meet her, scraping through the thin fabric of her slacks and biting into her knees. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers, a wave of shock that broke the surface of their murmurs. "Hey, that's too much," someone shouted, a woman's voice, sharp with indignation. She didn't even do anything. Emily braced herself against the ground, her palms stinging as she steadied her fall, her jaw clenched, a spark of anger flaring behind her calm exterior. She looked up at the officer towering over her, his shadow falling across her like a judgment all its own. "This isn't necessary," she said again, her voice low but laced with steel, each word deliberate and unflinching. "Cooperate," he snapped, his tone icy, his eyes narrowing as if her defiance was a personal affront. Before she could reply, a young man pushed through the crowd, his phone held high like a beacon. His dark hair was tousled, his expression a mix of nerves and righteous anger. "Why don't you let her explain?" he called out, his voice trembling but resolute. "You can't treat people like this." The camera lens caught the glint of the late afternoon sun, a silent witness to the escalating chaos. The younger officer stepped forward quickly, raising a hand to block the man's path. "Sir, step back," he said, his tone firm but tinged with unease. "You're interfering." The man bristled, planting his feet more firmly on the ground. "I'm not interfering, recording. This is public," he shot back, his voice rising with conviction. The older officer growled, a low, guttural sound, and shoved the man backward with one hand. The man stumbled, nearly dropping his phone, but he held his ground, the camera still rolling as the crowd's murmurs grew louder, more insistent. Emily pushed herself to her feet, the handcuffs pulling taut against her wrists as she rose. She turned to face the officers, her posture straight despite the ache in her knees. "This has gone far enough," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of unshakable resolve. "I've done nothing wrong, and I won't let you use unnecessary force to humiliate me further." Her words hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in dignity. The older officer's eyes narrowed to slits, his jaw tightening. "You don't get to decide that," he said flatly, his tone as unyielding as the concrete beneath their feet. Nearby, the supermarket manager stood with his arms crossed, his thin lips pressed into a smug line. He was a weary man in his late 40s, his tie slightly askew, his demeanor radiating self-righteous certainty. "This is what happens when people think they're above the law," he chimed in, his voice dripping with condescension. Emily turned to him, her gaze piercing through the haze of the moment. "And this is what happens when people are judged without evidence," she retorted, her words sharp enough to cut through his sanctimony. He opened his mouth to reply, but the rising tide of voices from the crowd swallowed his words whole. From the fringes of the gathering, a middle-aged woman stepped forward, her phone raised like a torch. Her curly hair framed a face creased with concern, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Why is this happening over a bottle of olive oil?" she called out, her voice ringing clear above the din. "What's really going on here?" Another voicey man's this time, gruff and incredulous, joined in. "She doesn't even look like a thief. This is ridiculous." But not all the sentiments were kind. A man in a faded jacket sneered, his lip curling. "Entitled people always think they can talk their way out of it." Another added, "Just because she's dressed nice doesn't mean she's innocent." The conflicting currents of opinion swirled round Emily like a storm, threatening to pull her under. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm amid the chaos. She'd faced prejudice before, quiet, subtle barbs that stung in their understated cruelty, but this was different. This was loud, public, and unrelenting. A spectacle that stripped away her dignity with every passing second. The younger officer glanced at her, then at the crowd, his brow furrowing. "Maybe we should just check the footage and clear this up," he said softly to his partner, his voice almost pleading. The older officer shot him a withering look, his patience long exhausted. "We're doing this by the book," he said firmly. "She can explain herself at the station." Emily's hands curled into fists, the metal cuffs digging deeper into her wrists. "You're arresting me without even reviewing the evidence over a false accusation," she said, her voice steady but threaded with outrage. "It's protocol," the older officer replied curtly, his words a brick wall she couldn't breach. The situation spiraled further as a teenage girl edged closer, her phone shaking in her small hands as she filmed. Her dark braids swung as she moved, her face set with a fierce determination that belied her youth. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. She hasn't even had a chance to tell her side. The older officer's head snapped toward her, his patience fraying to threads. "Stay back," he warned, his tone a low growl. But the girl stood her ground, her eyes blazing. "This is wrong, and everyone can see it." The tension thickened, the air crackling with unspoken defiance as the crowd inched closer, their phones a constellation of tiny lights capturing every moment. The younger officer raised his hands, his voice strained. "Everyone, step back, let us handle this." But the older officer had reached his limit. He flung open the patrol car door and turned to Emily, his expression a mask of cold authority. "Get in," he ordered. Emily hesitated, her gaze sweeping the crowd one last time. She found the teenage girl again, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared resolve. The girl's determination mirrored her own, a quiet strength that steadied Emily's racing heart. Then, without a word, she straightened her spine and stepped into the car, her movements deliberate, her dignity intact despite the indignity of the moment. The door slammed shut behind her, muffling the crowd's voices, but not silencing them entirely. She leaned back against the seat, the weight of the ordeal settling over her like a heavy cloak. Through the window, she caught sight of a man holding a sign he'd scrawled on the back of a crumpled grocery bag. "Injustice is the real crime." The words pierced her, and for a brief moment, her composure faltered. The absurdity of it all, sheer humiliation of being treated as a criminal, over a misunderstanding tender to overwhelm her. She closed her eyes, forcing the anger and frustration into a simmering calm she could control. The ride to the station was a tense, silent affair. The officers said nothing, their radios crackling faintly in the background, a soft static that filled the void. Emily stared out the window, her mind racing with the implications of what had happened. When they arrived, the older officer opened the door with a brusque gesture. "Let's go," he said, his voice rough with impatience. She stepped out without resistance, her head held high despite the ache in her wrists and the soreness in her knees. As she walked into the station, she felt the weight of curious stares from officers and staff, her presence an anomaly amid the sterile bustle of the building. They led her to a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs, the air heavy with the scent of disinfectant and old coffee. The younger officer gestured for her to sit, his tone softer than before. "We'll be back shortly," he said, almost apologetically. Emily nodded, watching as the door clicked shut behind them. For the first time, she was alone, the silence pressing down on her like a physical force. She looked at her bound wrists, the cuffs glinting dully under the fluorescent light, and exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about the countless others who had faced the same injustice, who had been deemed guilty without a chance to prove otherwise. The lesson burned in her chest. Justice was fragile, easily corrupted by those who wielded power without accountability. And the consequences of that abuse rippled far beyond the moment. Hours later, the shaky footage of her arrest exploded across the internet, igniting a firestorm of debate. The video captured every detail of older officer's rough grip, Emily's calm defiance, the crowd's growing outrage. "She hasn't even paid yet," a woman's voice cried out in the background, while another cut through sharper. "Why does she need to be handcuffed? This is excessive." By nightfall, hashtags like Justice Forumly and Bias in Action trended nationwide. The comments a chaotic blend of fury and disbelief. "Treated like a criminal for shopping, what year are we living in?" One user wrote. "This is systemic bias in action, disgusting," another added. But the backlash wasn't universal. Skeptics emerged, their words dripping with cynicism. "She's playing the victim for attention." One sneered. "Rich people love pretending their oppressed alarms don't go off for no reason," another insisted. At home, Emily sat on the edge of her couch, her phone buzzing relentlessly with notifications, texts from friends, emails from colleagues, tags from strangers. She scrolled through the flood of messages, her expression unreadable. The incident had thrust her into the center of a national conversation, a reluctant symbol of a broader struggle. She set the phone down, her hands trembling slightly, and stared into the dim light of her living room. The lesson lingered, heavy and undeniable. When power was abused, when justice was twisted, the consequences didn't just scar the individual, they fractured the trust of everyone watching. The room was dimly lit, the faint hum of a laptop fan cutting through the silence as Emily sat hunched over her desk, her fingers gripping the edges of her phone. Across from her, Miranda, her assistant, perched stiffly in a chair, her eyes darting between Emily and the glowing screen in front of her. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of what had spiraled far beyond their control. "It's been shared over 1,000,000 times now," Miranda said, her voice trembling slightly, laced with a worry she couldn't quite mask. "Every big news outlet's got it, CNN, BBC, you name it. Some are spinning it as textbook racial profiling." Emily's brow furrowed, her dark eyes narrowing as she stared at the phone. It screened a portal to a storm she hadn't asked for. The words stung, not because they were wrong, but because they scratched at a raw, aching truth she'd felt in her bones that day. "And the rest?" she asked, her tone sharp, almost daring Miranda to soften the blow. Miranda hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if searching for a way to cushion the inevitable. "There's pushback," she admitted finally, her voice dropping. "People are saying you staged it, calling it a publicity stunt. Some think you're just fishing for attention, to boost your own name." A bitter laugh escaped Emily's lips, short and jagged, as she shook her head in disbelief. "Of course they are," she muttered, her voice dripping with exhaustion and a quiet, simmering anger. She leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking under her weight, and let her gaze drift to the ceiling. Her mind churned, a chaotic whirl of frustration, humiliation, and something deeper, a gnawing sense of responsibility she hadn't signed up for. Miranda watched her, her expression softening into something tender, almost pleading. "You should say something, Em," she urged gently. "If you don't, they'll twist this however they want. You'll lose the story." Emily's jaw tightened, her thoughts racing like wildfire. She hated this idea of dragging a moment that had stripped her bare, left her trembling with indignity, into the harsh glare of public scrutiny. That day in the supermarket, the accusing stares, the cold grip of handcuffs, the officer's barked comments had been personal, a wound carved into her soul. But now it was a wildfire, blazing beyond her, igniting debates and divisions she couldn't ignore. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless others who'd felt that same sting, the ones whose stories never made it past a whisper. She exhaled, long and slow, and nodded. "All right," she said, her voice steadying with resolve. "I'll do it." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of her office, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor as Emily typed out her statement. Her fingers moved with purpose, each word a brick in the wall she was building it just for herself, but for something bigger. When she posted it, the response was instantaneous, a digital tidal wave crashing across the internet. "Yesterday, I felt what so many endure every single day," she'd written, her words raw and unflinching. "I was judged, mistreated, reduced to an assumption instead of a person. The support I've received humbles me, but this isn't about me alone. It's about the systemic biases that crush countless lives, the voices that go unheard. I'm taking action not just for myself, but for them. We need accountability. We need change." Within hours, the post had exploded hundreds of thousands of likes, shares ricocheting across platforms, a chorus of voices rising in its wake. The comment section became a tapestry of pain and solidarity, each story a thread in a larger, uglier pattern. "I got accused of stealing once, just for wearing a hoodie in a store," one person wrote, their words heavy with resignation. "This hits home," another added. "The cops stopped me in my own neighborhood because I look suspicious. Keep fighting, Emily." She scrolled through them late into the night, her chest tightening with every tale, each one a mirror to her own. But the tide of support was laced with venom, too. Critics swarmed like flies, their words sharp and accusing. "She's just playing the victim to save her image," one user sneered, their comment racking up likes from a faceless mob. "Classic PR move and nothing real here." Another jabbed, "If she wasn't so smug in that video, maybe people wouldn't think she deserved it." Emily read those, too, her stomach twisting as the doubts crept in. Had she been too defiant, too proud? She shoved the thoughts aside, but they lingered, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. The video kept spreading, a relentless force feeding the machine of public opinion. By evening, it was everywhere, news channels dissecting it, talk shows turning it into a battlefield. On one program, a host leaned forward, his voice booming with conviction. "Emily Carter's arrest is a glaring abuse of power," he declared, slamming a fist on the table. "It's another brick in the wall of evidence that certain groups are targeted, day in and day out." Across the panel, another pundit smirked, shaking his head. "Come on, this is a misunderstanding blown way out of proportion. If she'd just complied, we wouldn't be here." Guilty or not, she escalated it. The argument raged on, voices overlapping in a cacophony of outrage and dismissal. While Emily watched from her living room, her hands clenched into fists. Outside the supermarket where it all began, the air buzzed with tension. Protesters had gathered by mid-morning, their signs thrusting into the sky like spears. "Stop the bias. Accountability now." The crowd swelled as the day wore on, a mix of fury and hope drawing them together. Inside the store, the managero weary man named Greg, whose pinched face had been the first to accuse Emily, paced near the entrance, his footsteps sharp against the tiled floor. "This is spiraling," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow as he glanced at the growing throng outside. Beside him, a security guard named Tony, broad-shouldered, with a jaw set like stone, crossed his arms. "They're not coming in," he said gruffly. "Long as they stay out there, we're good." But the line between order and chaos was fragile. A young protester, barely old enough to vote, climbed onto a crate, his voice crackling through a megaphone. "This store rakes in money from our neighborhoods, then treats us like thieves," he shouted, his eyes blazing with a fire born of too many unheard cries. "Enough," the crowd roared, a wave of sound that rattled the glass doors. A handful surged forward, pressing against the guards stationed at the entrance. Tony stepped up, his hand raised like a wall. "Back off," he barked, shoving a weary kid in a red jacket. The boy stumbled, catching himself on a friend's shoulder. But another protester, a woman with braided hair and fury in her eyes, shouldered a water bottle in retaliation. It sailed through the air, smacking Tony's chest with a dull thud. In an instant, the scene fractured. Shouts erupted. A tangle of bodies pushing and pulling as security fought to hold the line. "Don't touch him," a voice screamed, high and desperate, while another yelled. There it again. Film this. Phones flashed, capturing every shove, every shout. As police sirens wailed in the distance, officers spilled from their cars, forming a human barricade between the store and the crowd, their faces grim under the weight of a moment they couldn't control. Meanwhile, the supermarket scrambled to douse the flames. Late that afternoon, they posted a statement online, the words dripping with careful corporate polish. "We deeply regret the incident involving Ms. Carter. We're reviewing our policies and committing to additional training to prevent future misunderstandings." It landed like a stone in a raging river. Critics pounced, calling it a hollow gesture, a band-aid on a gaping wound. "This isn't regret, it's damage control," one commenter fired back, their words echoing a sentiment that rippled through thousands of others. The backlash grew teeth when a former employee, a soft-spoken woman named Carla, who'd quit months earlier, spoke to a local reporter under the cloak of anonymity. "They trained us to watch certain people more closely," she confessed, her voice trembling with guilt. "They never said minorities outright, but we knew. Anyone who didn't fit the look, poor, black, Latino, got the extra eyes." Her words hit the airwaves like a thunderclap, fueling calls for a boycott. By noon the next day, protesters lined the sidewalk outside the Palo Alto store, their chants rising like a storm. Inside, Greg's nerves frayed further. He hovered near the windows, peering through the blinds at the sea of signs and faces. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice tight with panic. Tony, still stationed by the door, shrugged. "They're mad. Can't say I blame them." Greg shot him a glare, but Tony didn't flinch. He'd seen too much in his years on the job to pretend this was just noise. Across town, Emily stood at the podium in her foundation's headquarters, the room packed with reporters, their cameras flashing like a swarm of fireflies. Dressed in a simple black suit, she carried herself with a quiet strength that silenced the chatter as she stepped forward. "Let me be clear," she began, her voice steady but edged with steel. "This isn't about one bad day in a supermarket. It's about a system, a pattern that lets bias and assumptions decide who gets dignity and who gets handcuffs. It's about the people who don't have a microphone, who don't have the chance to fight back." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room, letting the gravity of her words sink in. "To those who think this is about me or some game for attention, I ask you to look harder. This is about justice. This is about change." Her speech lit a fuse. Clips of it raced across social media, her poise and clarity earning praise from strangers and activists alike. But it wasn't vindication she wanted, it was action. The police department, now under a microscope, faced a swelling tide of scrutiny. The video of her arrest played on loop, the officer's sharp commands and her calm defiance raising questions that wouldn't fade. Activists demanded bias training, oversight, accountability to crack the armor of a system they saw as rotten. Chief Alan Boyd, a stern man with graying hair and a face carved from years of hard choices, stepped before the press, flanked by officers in crisp uniforms. "The team followed protocol," he said, his tone clipped and unyielding. "But we recognize this could have been handled with more care. We're reviewing it." His words were a match to dry grass. Protesters flooded the streets outside the station, their voices rising in a unified demand for justice, and not just for Emily, but for every name etched into the long, silent list of the wronged. She watched it all unfold, her heart heavy but resolute. In every interview, every broadcast, she hammered the same truth. "This isn't about one person, one store, one cop," she said, her eyes burning with conviction. "It's about building a world where dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right." Her voice became a beacon, pulling in donations, sparking movements, shifting the spotlight from her to the machinery of power and prejudice that had churned for too long. Justice, she knew, wasn't a gift, it was a fight, and the consequences of letting power run unchecked. They were written in every story, every sign, every shout echoing through the streets. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the police station's briefing room. As Chief Boyd stood before a swarm of reporters, his weathered face taut with strain, the air buzzed with restless energy, microphones thrust forward like spears, each journalist eager to pierce through his carefully constructed facade. One voice cut through the clamor. Chief Boyd, do you truly believe handcuffing Miss Carter was justified under the circumstances? The question hung heavy, and for a fleeting moment, Boyd faltered, his brow furrowed, his lips parting slightly as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Then, his expression hardened, a wall slamming down over his uncertainty. Our officers made a call based on what they knew in that moment, he said, his voice clipped. Deliberate. Out there, in the field. Decisions aren't made with the luxury of hindsight, they are forged in the heat of high-pressure chaos. But the reporters weren't satisfied. Another voice, sharp and unrelenting, pressed deeper. What about the allegations of bias? Activists are pointing out loudly that incidents like this seem to target minorities far more often than anyone else. Boyd's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching beneath his stubbled cheek. He shifted his weight, the creak of his polished boots barely audible over the hum of the room. We don't tolerate racial profiling in this department, he said, his tone growing brittle. This case followed protocol period. That said, any claims of misconduct will be investigated thoroughly. You have my word on that. His assurances landed like stones in a restless sea, stirring immediate ripples of dissent. Critics in the crowd bristled, their murmurs rising into accusations defensive, dismissive, a dodge of responsibility. Outside, the air crackled with defiance as protesters gathered, their chants of no justice, no peace rolling through the streets like thunder. Signs demanding reform bobbed above the swelling crowd, a vivid tapestry of outrage unfurling under the graying sky. Inside the station, the mood was no less volatile. In the break room, officers slumped over lukewarm coffee, their voices a tangled mix of frustration and fatigue. One veteran, his uniform slightly rumpled from a long shift, leaned against the counter, his grizzled face twisted in a scowl. "It's not fair," he muttered, stirring his coffee with more force than necessary. "We bust our backs out there doing the job we're trained for, and now we're the villains? All because some billionaire got her ego bruised." His words dripped with bitterness, his hands tightening around the mug as if it could shield him from the growing storm. Across the room, a younger officer fidgeted, his eyes darting toward the floor. He was barely out of the academy, his uniform still crisp, his idealism not yet worn thin. "It's not just about her," he said softly, almost to himself. "People are furious because this isn't new. It keeps happening. Maybe they've got a point. Maybe we should listen." His voice wavered, caught between duty and doubt. But before the veteran could snap back, the door swung open. Another officer poked his head in, his face grim. "Crowd's getting bigger out there. Chief wants everyone on standby." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. High above the chaos, in a sleek office lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, Emily Carter sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the muted hum of her laptop. The city sprawled below, a restless sprawl of concrete and flickering lights. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the incident, the handcuffs biting into her wrists, the cold indifference of the officer's stares. She'd kept her silence since her initial statement, a deliberate pause as she weighed her next move. The door creaked open, and Miranda stepped in, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She carried a tablet, her expression a mix of exhaustion and urgency. "The supermarket's scrambling to control the damage," she said, setting the device on Emily's desk with a soft thud. "They've rolled out mandatory bias training for all their staff, trying to look proactive." Emily arched an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint, dry smile. "A convenient little gesture," she said, her voice low and edged with skepticism. "But a few training sessions won't uproot a culture that's rotten with discrimination." Miranda nodded, her fingers lingering on the tablet. "The police aren't faring much better." Boyd's press conference was a disaster. "People are calling for his head now." Emily leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled as her mind churned. The apologies, the half-hearted promises, the flimsy defenses, they were all noise, meaningless without substance. This wasn't about soothing the public or ticking off boxes on some PR checklist. Real change demanded more. It meant tearing into the roots of the problem, exposing the decay of power left unchecked. This can't just fizzle out here, she said, her voice hardening with resolve. Workshops and press releases won't cut it. We need overhaul policies, oversight, accountability that actually sticks. Miranda hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly. You're going to push harder, aren't you? Emily met her assistant's gaze, unflinching. Harder and louder, she said, rising to her feet. Determination carved itself into every line of her face, a fire igniting behind her steady eyes. The protests, the arguments, the raw fury spilling into the streets, they were just the spark. She wouldn't let it die out, not when justice hung in the balance. Days later, Emily stood at a podium in a packed conference room, the air thick with anticipation. Journalists scribbled furiously, community leaders leaned forward in their seats, and business representatives shifted uncomfortably as her gaze swept over them. Dressed in her signature understated suit, she gripped the lectern, her knuckles whitening slightly as she steadied herself. When she spoke, her voice was calm but unyielding, each word a blade honed to cut through complacency. What happened last week was no one-off, it was a glaring symptom of a much deeper sickness. She began, her tone sharp and deliberate. Bias, whether it's subtle or screaming in your face, still dictates how people are treated every single day. This isn't just my story, it's the story of millions who face injustice in silence. That stops now. She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink into the room, her eyes locking onto the crowd as if daring them to look away. Today, I'm launching Project Equity, an initiative to tackle systemic bias head-on in retail, in law enforcement, everywhere it festers. We're rolling out mandatory training, resources for those who've been hurt, and legal funding to make sure no one fights alone. The room erupted in an uneven wave of applause, though the response was far from unified. Emily's gaze darted across the face and nodded, their expressions warm with approval. Others exchanged tight-lipped glances, skepticism etched into their frowns. Within hours, her announcement rippled outward, igniting a firestorm of attention. Newsrooms dissected her every word. Social media buzzed with fervent debate. Supporters cheered it as a bold leap toward justice, while detractors sneered, calling it a naive pipe dream. Her foundation's inbox overflowed with messages. CEOs from major retail chains and a top civil rights law firm pledged their backing, their emails brimming with cautious optimism. But the pushback was swift and fierce. The Retail Alliance, a powerhouse lobbying group, fired off a blistering rebuke. While we respect Ms. Carter's intentions, her measures are a financial sledgehammer, uniclist and crushing for retailers already scraping by on thin margins. Business leaders piled on, painting her as a disconnected idealist. One executive, smirking on a cable news segment, quipped, "She's got billions to burn. It's easy to play savior when money's no object." Undeterred, Emily doubled down, scheduling a public roundtable to hash out Project Equity's merits with the sharpest minds in the room. Among them was James Harrington, CEO of the supermarket chain where her ordeal had unfolded. The tension was electric as they faced off across a polished table, cameras whirring, reporters poised like hawks. Harrington, a suave man in his mid-50s with silver streaks in his hair, leaned forward, his voice smooth but laced with steel. "Miss Carter, your initiative sounds noble on paper, but it's a fantasy in practice. Bias training costs a fortune, and funding legal battles for every alleged victim, that's a minefield we can't navigate." Emily didn't flinch, her eyes locking onto his with icy precision. "Expensive," she countered, her tone cool but razor-sharp. "Let me tell you what's expensive, Mr. Harrington. Lawsuits piling up, customers boycotting your stores, trust crumbling because people feel hunted when they walk through your doors. Equity isn't a cost, it's survival." Harrington stiffened, his polished veneer cracking just enough to reveal the irritation beneath. "You're pinning this on retailers alone," he shot back. "Bias is society's mess. We are we the scapegoats?" Emily's voice rose, steady but fierce. Because it's happening in your stores, under your watch, your staff, your rule lest they are part of this. Burying your head in the sand doesn't erase that. The room hummed with unspoken tension. A reporter jumping in to fan the flames. Mr. Harrington, with all the heat your company's taken lately, isn't some kind of change inevitable? His jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. We're already stepping up new trainings in place. But Project Equity oversteps. It shoves solutions down our throats without a shred of practicality. Emily leaned closer, her voice slicing through his deflection. If companies like yours had faced this head-on years ago, we wouldn't need initiatives like mine. This isn't about easy, it's about owning up. The clash dominated the next day's headlines, splitting opinions down the middle. Supporters hailed Emily's grit, while critics grumbled she was burning bridges with potential allies. Yet the momentum didn't falter. Donations poured into Project Equity, fueled by grassroots fervor and corporate pledges alike. Pilot programs sprang up in select cities, with retail workers and officers sitting through raw, unfiltered bias training. At one session, a store manager, his face flushed with unease, admitted, "I never saw how much bias shaped what we do until now. It's tough to face, but it matters." Meanwhile, Emily pressed on, meeting lawmakers to push for federal mandates, her vision unrelenting. But the resistance lingered. At a closed-door gathering of retail tycoons, discontent simmered. One CEO, swirling a glass of bourbon, sneered, "Carter's on a guilt trip, playing the crusader. She doesn't get the wreckage she's leaving behind." Emily heard the whispers, but they only steeled her resolve. Justice wasn't a negotiation, and neither was she. The lesson was clear: power unchecked bred consequence, and she'd make sure the world felt its weight. Through whispered rumors and covert exchanges, Emily caught wind of a clandestine meeting where powerful players planned to sidestep her cause. Fueled by indignation, she sat at her cluttered desk late into the night, the glow of her laptop casting sharp shadows across her determined face. Her fingers flew across the keys as she poured her conviction into an impassioned op-ed for a prestigious business journal. "Equity isn't a choice you can opt out of," she wrote, her words pulsing with urgency. "If your profits hinge on turning a blind eye to injustice, then your entire foundation is flawed. Progress demands discomfort. It's a jagged pill to swallow, but the reward is a world worth building." When the piece hit the stands, it exploded across the internet like wildfire, reigniting a smoldering debate and dragging reluctant corporations into the spotlight. They could no longer hide. They had to declare where they stood on Project Equity. Her brainchild aimed at dismantling systemic wrongs. Despite the steep climb ahead, Emily's resolve never wavered. She marched into town halls, her voice echoing off the walls as she rallied weary citizens. She stood before college students, her eyes blazing with purpose as she urged them to join her fight, and she burned the midnight oil, stitching together a coalition of believers to push her vision forward. Slowly, the story she told began to shift. The tide to equity wasn't a burden to bear, but a necessity, a lifeline for both morality and prosperity. By month's end, the ground trembled as several retail giants bowed to the pressure, pledging their allegiance to Project Equity with promises of sweeping bias training and robust legal support for those wronged. What began as Emily's solitary stand swelled into a national chorus, a symphony of voices sharing tales of injustice that bound communities together. In a shared hunger for change, the echoes of Project Equity rippled outward with breathtaking speed. As Emily's movement gained traction, a deluge of stories poured in from every corner of the nation. Social media transformed into a tempestuous arena where the silenced found their roar, a digital stage for everyday people to lay bare the wounds of inequity. Among them was Carla, a young retail worker whose trembling voice carried the weight of years of suppressed fury. In a video that raced across screens, she recounted a moment that still gnawed at her soul: her manager's sharp reprimand for not shadowing customers of color closely enough. "They never said it straight out," Carla confessed, her brown eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But the rule was there, unspoken yet deafening. Watch them harder. Expect the worst." She paused, her breath catching, then lifted her chin defiantly. "I walked away from that job because I couldn't stomach being their pawn anymore. This has to end." Her words struck a chord. the video amassing millions of views as comments flooded in like a tidal wave. "I've lived this too. This is why Project Equity matters. Thank you for speaking our truth." Carla's courage lit a fuse, her story a beacon for others to step into the light. Then came David Ortiz, a 42-year-old father whose life unraveled over a trivial misunderstanding. At a press conference orchestrated by a scrappy local activist group, he stood before a sea of microphones, his broad shoulders hunched under the weight of memory. "I never imagined something so small could shatter everything," he began, his voice thick with a grief he couldn't shake. 2 years earlier, he'd been accused of swiping a pair of headphones from a store. Despite the receipt crumpled in his pocket proving he'd paid, the employees didn't care. They summoned the police with cold efficiency. "They wouldn't hear me out," David said, his hands shaking as he gripped the mic, reliving the humiliation. "One officer slammed me to the pavement so hard my shoulder popped out of its socket. I spent the night in a cell, my kids at home wondering if I'd vanished forever." The charges dissolved when grainy security footage cleared his name, but the scars lingered. Months of grueling physical therapy, the sit-along glances from neighbors who now saw him as tainted. "I was just another face they pegged as trouble," he said, tears spilling over as the crowd erupted in applause. His pain hung in the air, a raw testament to why the fight mattered, a rallying cry that shook the movement to its core. Justice, David's story screamed, wasn't a luxury, it was a debt long overdue. Emily watched this flood of testimonies unfold from her modest office, a storm of emotions churning within her. Pride swelled in her chest at the bravery of those stepping forward, yet her heart ached with every tale of shattered lives. Her team scrambled to capture it all: videos, written accounts, tear-streaked interviews, building a tapestry that laid bare the sprawling scope of the crisis. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the blinds, her colleague Miranda burst into a meeting, her face a mask of urgency. "You need to see this," she said, sliding her tablet across the scarred wooden table. Emily's eyes scanned the screen, her jaw tightening as she absorbed the details. A young man in Arizona, arrested for loitering outside a convenience store while waiting for his sister's car to roll up. "It turned ugly," Miranda explained, her voice low. "The cops said he resisted, but people on the street caught it all on their panache, was begging them to stop. As they pinned him against a cruiser and hit him with a taser." Emily shoved the tablet aside, a slow burn of anger rising beneath her calm facade. "This can't just be noise," she said, her tone steely. "Outrage isn't enough, we need answers, we need change." The stories weren't just piling up. They were a call to arms, a demand for consequences to match the crimes. The tide didn't stop with individuals. Small businesses and local groups began peeling back their own layers of guilt. In Chicago, a supermarket chain's CEO stepped into the harsh glare of a TV studio, his tie slightly askew as he faced the cameras. "We've let people down," he admitted, his voice gravelly with reluctant accountability. "We fired employees for profiling customers after the community called us out. What happened in our stores was wrong, and we're owning it." Not every company bent so easily. Some dug in their heels, one retailer scoffing that the whole uproar was a tempest in a teapot. That arrogance ignited a backlash. Boycotts sprang up overnight, and protesters clogged their parking lots with signs and chants. "They can plug their ears all they want," Emily declared during a packed panel discussion, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "But the people's chorus is deafening, and we won't rest until this rot is uprooted." Justice, she implied, wasn't a negotiation, it was a reckoning for those who wielded power without care. Amid the clamor, a quieter voice pierced through. Tasha, a young woman who'd witnessed Emily's own clash with injustice at a supermarket, posted a video that trembled with restrained fury. "I was there that day," she began, her gaze steady as she stared into the camera. "I saw them swarm her, treat her like she was nothing before she could even open her mouth. And it's not just Harry've seen it too many times." Her words carried the weight of countless unspoken moments, her honesty slicing through the chaos of online arguments. "We can't let this keep happening," she said, her voice rising with resolve. "If we don't rise up now, we're condemning ourselves to more of the same." Shared endlessly, her message sparked a fresh surge of action. Town halls sprang up in sleepy suburbs. Letters piled up on officials' desks, and communities demanded more than promises. Yet with every step forward, Emily felt the burden grow heavier. Late one night, surrounded by her bleary-eyed team, she leaned forward in her chair, her hands clasped tightly. "Every story is a life," she said, her voice unwavering despite the exhaustion etching lines into her face. "We can't falter now. This is about them, all of them." Miranda, her right hand through the chaos, nodded grimly. "The fire's spreading, but we've got to keep stoking it." Emily's eyes narrowed. "We will. This is only the start." Project Equity morphed into something bigger than Emily had dared dream. A living, breathing force of nature. Her foundation forged alliances with grassroots warriors, funneling resources to those battling on the front lines. Protests gave way to policy drafts, raw anger hardening into calculated steps toward justice. The supermarket chain, where Emily's ordeal began, buckled under the relentless glare of public scrutiny. At a televised press conference, the CEO's face glistened with sweat as he outlined their overhaul. "Effective immediately. Every employee from the top brass to the stockroom will undergo anti-bias training," he announced, his voice strained but firm. "We're starting where it happened, in Palo Alto, and rolling it out across every store in 6 months." Reporters pounced. "Does this mean you admit it's systemic?" one demanded. The CEO faltered, then steadied. "We see the biases in the world, and we're not above them. This is our first move to fix it." The reforms were real money and time poured into a problem they could no longer dodge. Meanwhile, the local police department faced its own storm. Protesters camped outside the precinct, their voices a constant drumbeat of accountability. Under the crush of attention, Chief Alan Boyd stepped up, his jaw tight as he addressed the crowd. "We hear you," he said, the words clipped but heavy. "We're reviewing our rules, top to bottom." It was a rare crack in the armor, a hint that the abuse of power might finally face its consequence. A lesson Emily knew was centuries in the making, but one she'd fight to see through. The air in the police department buzzed with a restless energy as Chief Boyd stood at the front of a dimly lit training room, his weathered hands gripping the edges of a podium. Behind him, a projector flickered to life, casting a stark white glow across the faces of the officers seated in rows attentive. Others slouched with arms crossed, their expressions a mix of indifference and thinly veiled frustration. The announcement had come down like a thunderclap. A sweeping overhaul of their training programs was underway. Mandatory de-escalation workshops, anti-bias seminars, and a newly formed oversight committee to scrutinize any hint of excessive force were now part of their reality. Boyd's voice carried a gravelly weight as he outlined the changes, but beneath his firm tone lay a flicker of uneasy and knew this wouldn't sit well with everyone. Outside, the city streets pulsed with a different kind of tension. News of the reforms rippled through the community, igniting a storm of reactions. In a small, cluttered coffee shop, a protest organizer named Lena perched on a stool, her fingers drumming against a chipped mug as she spoke to a local reporter. Her dark eyes flashed with a blend of hope and skepticism. "Training's a nice first step," she said, her voice sharp yet measured, "but it's like putting a bandage on a broken leg. Where's the accountability for the officers who've crossed the line? Where's the ironclad promise that justice isn't just a buzzword?" Her words hung heavy in the air, echoing the doubts of many who felt the reforms were a half-hearted gesture, too timid and far too late to mend the fractures between the police and the people they served. Inside the department, the first de-escalation workshop unfolded in a sterile conference room, its fluorescent lights humming overhead. Officer Daniel Pierce, a burly man with a perpetually furrowed brow, sat near the back, his arms folded tightly across his chest. He'd been part of the incident with Emily Carter's messy confrontation at the Palo Alto supermarket that had spiraled out of control and thrust the department into a harsh spotlight. Now, as the trainer's voice droned on about calming tense situations, Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The memory of that day gnawed at him, the way Emily's voice had trembled with defiance, the way he'd barked orders instead of listening. "I didn't think I was wrong back then," he muttered when pressed by the trainer, his words halting and raw. "But now, I see it. I could have slowed down, heard her out. I lit the match when I should have doused the fire." His admission drew a few raised eyebrows from his peers, a rare crack in the armor of a force trained to stand resolute. Not everyone shared Daniel's reluctant epiphany. Across the room, Officer Greg Hensley leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a faint sneer. "This is ridiculous," he whispered to the man beside him, his voice low but dripping with disdain. "One bad headline, and suddenly we're groveling. What's next? Apology letters?" His words were a quiet rebellion, a spark of resistance that simmered beneath the surface of the room. The trainer, a weary woman named Sarah with a no-nonsense stare, caught the murmur and turned sharply. "This isn't about one mistake," she snapped, her voice cutting through the hum of discontent. "It's about stopping the next one. If you think this is pointless, you're not just missing the lesson, you are the reason we need it." Her words landed like a slap, silencing Greg, but not erasing the defiance in his narrowed eyes. Meanwhile, across town, Emily Carter sat in a sleek boardroom at the supermarket's headquarters, her posture rigid with purpose. The polished mahogany table stretched between her and the CEO, a man named Richard Grayson, whose tailored suit and clipped tone exuded corporate confidence. Emily's eyes, fierce and unyielding, locked onto his as she pressed for more than vague assurances. "The public's tired of empty words," she said, her voice steady but edged with urgency. "They want proof, timelines you stick to, audits from outsiders, updates they can trust. Anything less, and they'll see right through this." Richard shifted in his seat, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "We're pouring resources into this, Ms. Carter," he replied, his tone tightening. "Change doesn't happen overnight." Emily didn't flinch. "Then don't hide that. Show them you mean it, not just that you're dodging the fallout." The air crackled with unspoken tension, but by the meeting's end, a fragile compromise emerged. Quarterly progress reports would be released, a small victory born from Emily's unrelenting push. Back at the police station, Emily's meeting with Chief Boyd unfolded in his cramped office, the walls lined with faded certificates and a single flickering lamp. Boyd leaned forward, his elbows resting on a cluttered desk, his face etched with the weariness of a man caught between duty and doubt. "I'll level with you," he began, his voice low and gruff. "This isn't going to be easy. The public's skeptical, sure, but some of my own people, they feel like scapegoats." Emily crossed her arms, her expression unreadable but her resolve palpable. "And how do you fix that?" she asked, her tone cool and probing. Boyd sighed. "We're making it clear this isn't about punishing the good ones, it's about raising the bar for everyone. But shifting a culture, that's a slow burn." Emily's eyes narrowed. "Slow won't cut it unless you're ready to face the hard stuff head on. The community's got their eyes on you, Chief. Platitudes won't hold them." Boyd gave a slow nod, the weight of her words settling into the lines of his face. "We keep you in the loop," he said quietly. "I just hope we don't fall short." Emily's response was blunt, unwavering. "You don't get to fall short." At the Palo Alto supermarket, the first anti-bias training session unfolded in a break room that smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning supplies. Employees sat in a loose circle, their uniforms wrinkled from long shifts, as an external consultant named Marissa guided them through role-playing exercises. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as a young cashier named Tara hesitated, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I never thought about it before," she admitted, her voice small but earnest. "I'd watched certain customers show they dressed, how they moved and assumed things. I told myself it was just being careful, but maybe it was unfair." Across the circle, a manager named Paul, his graying hair swept back, rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "I've done it too," he confessed, his tone heavy with realization. "Told my team to keep tabs on kids in hoodies, teens who looked off. I thought I was protecting the store. Now I see how messed up that was." The room grew quiet, the weight of their honesty settling like dust after a storm of fragile but vital step toward something better. For the police, progress crept along more stubbornly. In a cavernous training hall, officers faced real-life scenarios projected onto a screen, their hands hovering near imaginary holsters as they navigated split-second choices. During one exercise, Daniel Pierce was called to revisit Emily's case, step by agonizing step. The trainer's voice cut through the silence. "What could you have done differently?" Daniel stared at the floor, his broad shoulders slumping as the memory replayed in his mind, shouting. The tension, the moment he'd chosen force over patience. I could have listened, he said after a long pause, his voice thick with regret. Asked questions instead of assuming. Maybe that changes everything. The trainer nodded, pressing further. And what's the takeaway? Daniel's answer came softer, almost to himself. It might have kept things from blowing up. Not every officer shared his introspection. Some smirked or muttered about woke nonsense. But the seeds of change, however small, were taking root. As word of the reforms spread, the public's response shifted like tides. Activists like Lena kept their megaphones raised, demanding deeper accountability. Their voices a relentless drumbeat against complacency. Yet others began to soften, seeing the efforts as a fragile glimmer of hope. At a town hall in a drafty community center, a local leader named James stood beneath flickering lights, his baritone voice steady. This isn't the finish line, he said, his gaze sweeping the crowd, but it's a start. We've got to keep pushing, keep watching. Emily, standing at the back, nodded in silent agreement. Later, she took the stage, her presence commanding even in the worn auditorium of Eastwood High School, where she spoke to students with the same fire that had fueled her fight. This only happened because people refused to stay quiet, she told them, her voice ringing clear. But justice isn't a what I'm when it's a promise we keep fighting for. So these systems never slide back into the shadows. In that same auditorium, the students' faces ranged from curious to skeptical, their whispers filling the air as Emily posed a question that hung like a challenge. What would you do if you saw something wrong? A boy named Marcus, his jaw set with defiance, shot back. You talk a lot, but what's actually changing? Emily met his gaze, stepping closer. Words alone don't fix it, Marcus, you're right. But action starts with you. What would you shift? Caught off guard, he faltered, then said, maybe stop cops from judging people by their looks. Her nod was firm, encouraging. That's where it begins. Use your voice right, organize, demand. Small moves build revolutions. Another student, a girl with a hesitant tremor in her voice, asked, isn't it tiring to keep going when nothing changes? Emily's smile was weary, but warm. It is. Some days, you feel like you're shouting into the void. But every step counts. Quitting means losing, fighting means hope. Through it all, the lesson burned bright. Justice isn't a gift handed down, it's a fire stoked by those brave enough to demand it. And when power is abused, when trust is shattered, the consequences ripple far beyond the moment, carving a path that only relentless effort can redirect. Emily knew this, as did Lena, Daniel, and even the reluctant Greg. The road was long, the resistance fierce, but in every workshop, every tense meeting, every candid confession, a deeper truth emerged. Real change is messy, slow, and worth every ounce of the struggle. Emily Carter stood near the edge of a modest stage, her voice still echoing faintly in the auditorium as the last words of her speech settled over the crowd. The room buzzed with the restless energy of students, some shifting in their seats, others whispering to friends, but a few lingered near her, their faces alight with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Among them was Marcus, a lanky boy with a furrowed brow and hands shoved deep into his pockets. Earlier that day, he'd challenged her words, his voice sharp with doubt as he'd questioned why anyone should care about cops treating people differently when that's just how it is. Now, though, he shuffled forward, his sneakers scuffing the worn wooden floor. His skepticism softened into something more vulnerable. I didn't mean to sound like a jerk earlier, he muttered, his eyes darting to her face before dropping to the ground. His foot nudged a stray pencil left behind by some hurried student, and he kicked it aside as if it could distract from the weight of his admission. Emily tilted her head, her expression warm but unflinching. You weren't a jerk, she replied, her voice steady and kind. You were real. And real is where it all starts, where people stop pretending and start doing something. Her words hung between them, simple yet piercing, and Marcus shifted his weight, clearly wrestling with what to say next. He glanced up again, his dark eyes searching hers. So what if I actually wanted to do something? You know, about what I said about how things aren't fair. His tone was tentative, like he was testing the waters of a river he wasn't sure he could cross. Emily didn't hesitate. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small card emblazoned with the logo of her foundation, Project Equity. Handing it to him, she said, "Get in touch. We'll link you up with people who are already out there fighting those battles. But here's the thing, Marcus, it's on you to take that first step. No one's going to carry you there." He took the card, his fingers tightening around it as if it were a fragile lifeline, tossed to him in a storm. He nodded, a flicker of resolve sparking in his gaze, and then he melted back into the crowd, the card still clutched in his hand. Over the next few weeks, Emily's journey carried her across a patchwork of towns and cities, each school a new canvas for her message. In a rural community, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, she spoke to students whose classrooms were crumbling, their textbooks outdated and their futures dimmed by neglect. Their eyes widened as she described a world where their voices could demand better, though some stared back with the weary resignation of kids who'd learned too early that promises often fade. In a bustling urban district, where sirens wailed in the distance and chain-link fences framed the schoolyard, she tackled the heavy presence of police and the subtle, pervasive bias woven into their education. Here, the students were louder, some cheered, fists raised in eager defiance, while others crossed their arms, unconvinced that words could shift the weight of their reality. But Emily didn't flinch. She knew that even a single seed of change, planted in a skeptical heart, could grow into something unstoppable. One crisp afternoon, after a talk at a community center bathed in the golden glow of late-day sun, Emily's phone pinged with an email. It was Marcus. His message was short, but brimming with a quiet pride. He'd rallied a handful of classmates and convinced the school to host a meeting about bridging the gap between students and local cops. "It's not much yet," he wrote, "but it's a start." Reading his words, Emily felt a surge of warmth flood her chest, her lips curving into a smile she couldn't suppress. This was proof that her voice wasn't just echoing into the void, that the next generation was reaching out to grasp the torch she'd lit. Moments like these fueled her, rekindling the fire that had driven her to speak out in the first place. Later that week, Emily found herself in a cozy cafe, the kind with mismatched chairs and the faint aroma of cinnamon drifting from the counter. She sat across from Tasha, a young woman whose shaky hands betrayed the storm raging inside her. Tasha's jacket sleeve was frayed where she'd been picking at it, and her phone lay face down on the table, a silent shield against the flood of notifications that had haunted her since her video went viral. That grainy footage of Emily being unjustly handcuffed outside a supermarket had ignited a firestorm across the country, and Tasha, the accidental spark, was still reeling from the blaze. "Thanks for meeting me," Emily began, her voice soft but deliberate, like a hand extended to someone teetering on a ledge. "I know this has turned your life upside down." Tasha nodded, her gaze fixed on the table's scratched surface. "I didn't think it'd get this big," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw what was happening, and I thought someone needed to know." Her fingers twitched toward her phone, then pulled back, as if the weight of those millions of views might crush her. Emily leaned in, her eyes locking onto Tasha's with quiet intensity. "And because you cared enough to hit record, they did. That took guts more than you might realize." Tasha finally looked up, her face a tangle of fear and defiance. "It didn't feel like guts," she admitted. "I was just there, shaking, pressing the button." But now she paused, her breath hitching. "People are messaging me. Some say I did good, but others are furious. They say I trashed the store's name, that I should have stayed quiet. It's messing with my head, that I screw everything up." Emily set her tea down with a deliberate clink, her expression hardening like steel tempered by fire. "Listen to me. Tasha, you did the right thing. Those people yelling at you, they're not mad because you lied. They're mad because you held up a mirror they didn't want to look into. That's what truth does, it shakes things loose." Tasha blinked, her hands curling tighter around her phone as if it could anchor her. "But what if they're right?" she pressed, her voice cracking. "What if I should have just walked away?" "No," Emily said firmly, shaking her head. "Walking away lets the rot fester. That video didn't just show my story, it showed what could happen to anyone, anywhere. And now, because of you, people are talking. They're pushing back. That's not a mistake, it's a beginning." Tasha's eyes flickered with doubt, her lips trembling. "But why me? I'm not anyone important." I'm just me. Emily's tone softened, a gentle current beneath her resolve. You don't need to be some big name to matter. You cared, and you acted. That's the spark that changes things. Tasha looked away, her gaze drifting to the window where rain streaked the glass in jagged lines. I didn't expect one stupid video to feel this heavy, she murmured. Emily nodded, her face reflecting the weight Tasha carried. It is heavy. Standing up means you're a target for praise, for hate, for everything in between. But every fight for what's right starts with someone like you. Someone who sees the wrong and says no more. Silence settled over them, thick and contemplative, broken only by the distant clatter of dishes from the cafe's kitchen. Tasha chewed her lip, her thoughts a tangled dance behind her eyes. I keep wondering what would have happened if I hadn't been there, she said finally, her voice small. If no one saw it. Emily's gaze grew steady, unwavering. It would have vanished, buried under excuses like so many other stories. But you were there. You chose to show it. Don't ever sell that short. Tasha's shoulders eased slightly, a faint glimmer of purpose breaking through her haze of doubt. I want to do more, she said, hesitant but earnest. I just don't know where to start. I don't have what you have, a voice people listen to. Emily smiled, a quiet, knowing curve of her lips. You don't need a stage. You just need to keep speaking when it counts. Share what you've seen. Stand with someone who's hurting. Join the people already out there fighting. Every step you take adds up. For the first time, Tasha's eyes brightened, a fragile hope blooming in their depths. You really think I can do something? She asked, almost pleading. Emily didn't hesitate. You already have. The conversation shifted as Emily laid out the vision of Project Equity, her words alive with passion. She described a network of everyday people like Tasha who'd witnessed the cracks in the system and dared to shine a light on them. You're the heart of this, Emily said, her voice ringing with conviction. One person, one choice, if that's how it spreads. Tasha nodded, a spark of steel hardening her resolve. I want in, she said, her voice steady now. Whatever I can do. Before they parted, Emily slid a slip of paper across the table, her personal number scrawled in neat ink. If it gets too much, call me, she said, her tone a lifeline. You're not alone in this. Tasha's lips curved into a small, genuine smile, the first Emily had seen from her that day. Thank you, Ms. Carter, for everything. Emily shook her head, her eyes warm. No, Tasha, thank you. You showed the world what one small move can do. That night, as rain tapped against her window, Emily sat alone, replaying their meeting in her mind. Tasha's raw courage, the way she'd trembled yet stood firm, mirrored the fire that had driven Emily to start this fight. Change wasn't forged by the powerful alone. It was carved out by the stubborn, quiet bravery of people who refused to let injustice slide. Tasha's story was a thread in a growing tapestry, a reminder that every ripple could build into a wave. Months later, that wave crested with the release of Invisible Chains, a documentary that bore the scars and triumphs of Emily's movement. In a dimly lit editing room, surrounded by her production team, Emily watched the final cut unfold on screen. The opening was raw and unrelenting, grainy clips of her own arrest, the cold steel of handcuffs glinting under fluorescent lights, paired with the wide-eyed shock of bystanders and the clipped voices of news anchors. A haunting score pulsed beneath it, a rhythm that mimicked a heart racing toward breaking. This isn't just my fight, Emily told the team, her voice thick with purpose as the footage rolled. It's about the ones who never got to speak, the ones we're giving a voice to now. The film wove together stories that cut deep. There was David Ortiz, a father whose broad shoulders seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. On screen, his voice cracked as he described the night he was tackled in front of his kids, the pavement biting into his skin while their cries pierced the air. I kept thinking, what if they don't believe me? What if I don't come back? He said, his eyes glistening with a pain that refused to fade. Another thread followed Carla, a former store clerk whose hands twisted nervously as she spoke. She'd walked away from her job after being told to shadow customers based on how they looked, her conscience gnawing at her until she couldn't bear it. I didn't see it at first how much I was part of the problem, she confessed, her voice trembling with regret and a newfound clarity. It's not just rules. It's what we let slide every day. The reenactments brought their words to life, actors stepping into their shoes, their faces etched with fear, defiance, and fragile hope as they played out scenes too real to feel staged. The film circled back to Emily, her own story laid bare in a way she'd never shared before. "I've been through tough spots," she said on screen, her gaze distant yet piercing. "But that day it broke something in me, and then it built something stronger." Her words were a quiet thunder, a testament to the cost of standing up and the power it unleashed. As the credits rolled, Emily knew this was more than a film. It was a mirror, a call, a warning. Justice wasn't a gift handed down. It was a fire stoked by those who dared to face the consequences of power run wild. And in every frame, she saw the lesson etched deep: when the mighty abuse their strength, it's the small, steady voices that rise to hold them accountable. Emily stood before the camera, her voice steady, yet laced with a quiet tremor born from years of bottled-up frustration. That day, the one where she'd been stripped of her dignity, treated as though she were less than human, still lingered in her mind like a stubborn shadow. It wasn't just the sting of humiliation that haunted her. It was the brutal realization that no amount of success, no pile of money, no polished resume could armor her against the jagged edges of prejudice. The memory clawed at her, a vivid reminder that this wasn't her fight alone. It was a battle shared by countless others, a collective wound demanding a collective stand. As she spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who'd stared into the abyss of injustice and refused to blink, her eyes burning with a resolve that dared the world to look back. The documentary reached its crescendo in a montage that hit like a tidal wave, raw, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. Grainy footage of students flooding school hallways flickered across the screen, their handmade signs held high like battle flags, each slogan scrawled in bold marker, a cry for something better. Their sneakers squeaked against the linoleum, a chaotic symphony of defiance as they marched past lockers and bulletin boards plastered with flyers. Then came the activists, their voices booming through megaphones at city council meetings, faces flushed with passion as they faced rows of stern officials in stiff suits, the tension crackling in the air like static before a storm. In quieter corners, retail workers huddled in break rooms, their aprons still dusted with flour or stained with coffee, whispering about bias training over lukewarm cups of Tismo, acts of resistance blooming in the shadows of fluorescent lights. The images stitched together a tapestry of struggle and hope, each frame a testament to the power of ordinary people daring to push back. As the film drew to a close, Emily's face filled the screen again, her gaze piercing through the lens like a blade. She didn't flinch, didn't soften her edges. "We live in a world where a single glance can sentence you," she said, her voice low but resonant, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water. Assumptions and judgments can unravel lives in an instant, tearing apart families, dreams, everything someone's fought to build. But it doesn't have to stay that way. Change isn't some distant dream we sit around waiting for. It's a fire we ignite ourselves. You don't need wealth, power, or a spotlight. All it takes is caring enough to do something, anything. Together, we can carve out a world where justice isn't a rare gift, but the foundation we all stand on. It begins with you. The screen faded to black, leaving only a stark question hanging in the silence. What will you do? It wasn't a plea, it was a challenge, daring every viewer to decide where they stood. The film launched online, free for anyone with an internet connection, a deliberate choice to tear down barriers and let its message ripple as far as it could reach. Within days, the view count soared into the millions, a digital wildfire spreading across screens worldwide. Social media erupted, hashtags like Invisibilections and Break the Cycle lighting up feeds as people poured out their own stories, painful, raw, and real. One viewer, tears still fresh on her cheeks, typed, "I watched this and sobbed. I've lived that humiliation, that erasure. Thank you for giving us a voice." Another chimed in, fingers trembling over the keyboard. "This isn't just a movie, it's a wake-up call. It's fuel for a fight we can't ignore." The words pulsed with urgency, each post a spark adding heat to a movement that refused to flicker out. Beyond the glow of screens, the film's impact seeped into the physical world, stirring life into dusty community centers and crowded classrooms. At a local screening, folding chairs scraped against tile floors as neighbors settled in. their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Afterward, voices overlapped in heated discussion, some shaky with emotion, others sharp with ideas about how to confront bias in their own backyards. Schools wove the film into lesson plans, teachers pausing the video to let students wrestle with questions about fairness and power, their young minds buzzing with revelations they hadn't been taught to see before. Even corporations, prodded by a public that wouldn't look away, began screening it for employees. One retail giant, its logo plastered across strip malls nationwide, issued a statement that rang with reluctant accountability. After watching Invisible Chains, we see the gaps in our own house. We're pledging to dig deeper, to be transparent, to do better. The words felt hollow to some, a PR stunt to others, but they marked a crack in the armor of complacency. Emily's inbox became a floodgate, misses pouring in like a relentless tide. Supporters sent gratitude that warmed her chest, their words wrapping around her like a shield. Critics sneered, their emails dripping with doubt about her intentions, accusing her of chasing clout or stirring trouble. But the ones that stopped her cold were the stories of people moved to act. Marcus, a lanky high schooler she'd met months ago during a community talk, wrote with a fervor that leaped off the screen. We screened it at school. Kids who never cared before were arguing in the halls, and teachers admitted they'd been blind to this stuff. You lit something in me, Emily. I'm not sitting back anymore. Then there was Carla, the ex-retail worker whose quiet courage had flickered in the film. Her email trembled with vulnerability. Seeing my face up there shook me to my core. I left that job because it broke me, but now I'm starting over. I won't shut up about this ever. Each letter was a thread, weaving a network of voices that stretched far beyond Emily's own. Late one night, as the city skyline glittered beyond her office window, Emily leaned back in her chair, her mind a whirlwind of exhaustion and possibility. The supermarket incident, one that had left her trembling with rage and shame, had morphed into something bigger than she'd ever imagined. It wasn't just her pain anymore. It was a beacon, a rallying cry for the Tashas, Davids, and Carlos of the world, the ones who'd been dismissed, overlooked, crushed under the weight of unchecked power. She turned to Miranda, her confidant and co-conspirator, her voice soft but fierce against the hum of the late-night quiet. This isn't about me now, it never really was. It's about them, the ones who've been invisible too long. They're the ones carrying this forward. The fight stretched out ahead, vast and daunting. But for the first time, the weight didn't crush her. She wasn't alone in it anymore. Across town, in a cafe that buzzed with its usual Saturday morning rhythm, Mark sat hunched over a lukewarm latte, his world narrowing to the man a few tables away. The faint hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of baristas swapping gossip, the clink of porcelain against wood, it all faded into a dull hum, drowned out by the pounding in his chest. The man sipped his coffee, oblivious, flipping through his phone with the casual ease of someone who belonged anywhere he chose to be. But to Mark, that ease felt wrong, out of place, a quiet taunt that gnawed at him. His leg jittered under the table, his fingers clutching his phone as he stole another glance. He'd made the call minutes ago, a decision that now sat like lead in his gut, and every tick of the clock stretched into eternity. The door chimed, sharp and sudden, snapping Mark's head up. Two police officers stepped inside, their white faces blank, but their strides purposeful, cutting through the cafe's cozy haze. They scanned the room, their eyes landing on the man with a precision that made Mark's throat tighten. This was the moment he'd set in motion. He shifted in his seat, breath shallow, watching as the officers closed the distance. The man didn't notice at first, lost in whatever scrolled across his screen, until one officer cleared his throat dry, a fish's sound that sliced through the air. The man looked up, his brow creasing in confusion, then hardening as he registered the uniforms looming over him. "Good morning, sir," the taller officer began, his tone clipped and formal, a practiced neutrality that barely masked the authority behind it. "Can we see some ID?" The man blinked, caught off guard, his phone landing on the table with a soft thud. "Excuse me," he replied, his voice steady but laced with a guarded edge, like a man who'd learned to brace himself for moments like this. The officer didn't waver. "Your ID, sir, and any proof of ownership for the vehicle parked outside." Confusion deepened in the man's eyes. but he reached for his wallet without protest, sliding his driver's license across the table with a raised eyebrow. "What's this about?" he asked, a thread of irritation weaving into his calm. Mark's stomach churned as he watched the officer inspect the ID, flipping it over as if it might reveal some hidden truth. "We got a report about a possible stolen vehicle matching your car's description," the officer said, his grip firm on the card. "We need to verify you're the owner." The man exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that seemed to hold a storm in check. The cafe fell silent. Baristas froze mid-motion. Customers glanced over mugs, their curiosity thinly veiled. He leaned back, crossing his arms, his voice sharpening. "So, let me get this right. Someone thinks I stole my own car. That's what you're saying." Mark swallowed hard, guilt clawing up his spine, but he clung to the excuse. It was just protocol, just caution, right? "Yes, sir," the officer replied, unfazed. "If you've got proof of ownership, we can sort this out fast." The man stared, then let out a brittle laugh, sharp and humorless. "Unbelievable," he muttered, digging into his pocket. He slid a key fob across the table, the logo of a sleek luxury brand glinting under the cafe lights. The officer picked it up, nodded to his partner, and stepped outside to run the check. The manmer, Bennett, as Mark would later learn, shook his head, his gaze drifting around the room. For a fleeting second, it locked with Mark's, and Mark jerked his eyes to his phone, sweat beading on his palms. Time crawled. When the officers returned, their faces had shifted, less certain, tinged with unease. The taller one approached, handing back the ID and keys with a softer tone. "Mr. Bennett, we've confirmed the car's yours. We're sorry for the inconvenience." Bennett took the items slowly, his expression a mask of calm fury, his eyes smoldering. He leaned forward, voice low and cutting. "Inconvenience? You call accusing me of stealing my own car an inconvenience?" The officer shifted, boots scuffing the floor, caught off guard by the quiet venom in Bennett's words. "Sir, we were just following up on a report." But Bennett wasn't finished. He stood, gathering his things with deliberate care, his movements sharp with restrained anger. "A report," he echoed, the word dripping with disdain. "Next time, maybe ask yourself who's making these reports and why." He walked out, leaving the officers standing awkwardly in his wake, the cafe buzzing back to life as if nothing had happened. Mark stayed rooted to his seat, the weight of what he'd done sinking deeper. A lesson in justice and consequence he hadn't meant to learn. Emily's journey had begun with a moment of degradation that could have festered in silence. Instead, it ignited a monumental wildfire of hope, resilience, and reckoning. Her story, and Bennett's, and countless others whispered a truth. Power-abused breeds suffering, but power-challenged breeds change. It's not enough to see the cracks in the world, you have to pry them open, step through, and build something new. So what will you do? Stay silent? Or join the chorus demanding a world where justice isn't a privilege, but a promise? The choice is yours, and the clock is ticking. The air in the cafe hung heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to cling to every surface, every table, every chipped mug, every whispered conversation abruptly cut short. Mark sat hunched in his chair, his shoulders sinking lower with each passing second, as if the weight of the world had chosen that exact moment to settle squarely on his back. Across the room, Mr. Marcus Bennett stood, his presence commanding despite the quiet fury simmering beneath his polished exterior. His voice sliced through the stillness, sharp and deliberate, as he recounted the incident that had brought them to this suffocating standoff. "Someone saw a black man driving a nice car," he said, his tone steady but laced with a bitter edge, "and figured I must be a criminal. That's what this is about, isn't it?" The words landed like blows, each one striking Mark harder than the last, leaving him breathless, his chest tight with a mix of dread and dawning realization. The cafe, once buzzing with the soft hum of morning chatter, had fallen into an eerie silence. The clatter of a spoon against a saucer somewhere in the back felt deafening in the void. Mark's hands trembled slightly as they rested on the table, his untouched coffee growing cold in its ceramic prison. He wanted to shrink into himself, to disappear beneath the worn wooden tabletop, but there was no escaping the piercing weight of Mr. Bennett's gaze. It wasn't just anger in those eyes, it was disappointment, a quiet condemnation that made Mark feel smaller than he ever had before. He had only meant to do the right thing, or so he'd told himself that morning when he'd picked up the phone, his voice steady as he reported what he thought was suspicious behavior. Protecting the neighborhood, that was his justification, his shield. But now, as Mr. Bennett's words echoed in his skull, that shield crumbled into dust. The officer standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, his boots scuffing against the tiled floor as he tried to muster a response. "Sir, he began, his voice faltering, caught off guard by the intensity of the moment. But Mr. Bennett cut him off, his movements swift and purposeful as he reached for his jacket draped over the back of a chair. "Save it," he said, his tone clipped, final. "You've done enough for one day." The rustle of fabric filled the air as he shrugged the jacket on, each motion deliberate, radiating a quiet dignity that made Mark's stomach twist. As Mr. Bennett turned to leave, he paused, his eyes locking onto Mark's with an intensity that felt almost physical-like, a hand gripping his throat. For a fleeting second, Mark's mind scrambled for something to say, some desperate string of words to explain himself, to claw back a shred of dignity. But before he could even part his lips, Mr. Bennett shook his head, his expression hardening into something cold, unyielding. "You," he said, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper, "you did this, didn't you?" Mark's mouth went dry, the air around him thickening until it felt like he was drowning in it. He wanted to deny it, to shout that it wasn't true, that he wasn't that kind of person. But the lie wouldn't form. His tongue felt heavy, useless, pinned down by the truth he couldn't face. Instead, he sat there, frozen, a statue carved from shame as Mr. Bennett's gaze bore into him, stripping away every excuse he'd clung to. "Next time," Mr. Bennett continued, his voice so soft it barely carried across the room, "think twice before you judge someone by the color of their skin." With that, he turned and strode out, the bell above the door jingling faintly as it swung shut behind him. The sound lingered, a haunting note that seemed to mock Mark as he sat there, adrift in the wreckage of his own making. The cafe slowly stirred back to life around him. A couple at a nearby table resumed their murmured conversation, their voices hushed as if afraid to disturb the fragile air. An older woman in the corner flipped a page of her newspaper, her eyes darting toward Mark for a split second before returning to the print. But he knew they'd seen it, a every agonizing second of the confrontation etched into their minds, no matter how hard they pretended otherwise. His coffee sat before him, a dark pool reflecting the dim overhead lights, its steam long gone. His hands, still resting on the table, felt slick with sweat, and for the first time in years, Mark was utterly lost. That morning, he'd woken up certain of his actions, convinced he was the good guy, the watchful neighbor keeping their quiet little corner of the world safe. Now, staring at the empty chair where Mr. Bennett had stood, all he could feel was the bitter sting of regret gnawing at his insides. When he finally pushed himself up from the table, his legs felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath him might give way at any moment. A few patrons glanced his way as he shuffled toward the door, their eyes flickering with something. Was it judgment, disgust, or maybe just curiosity? He couldn't tell, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. Maybe it was all in his head, a paranoid trick of his rattled mind. But the word racist slithered into his thoughts unbidden, heavy and suffocating, and he recoiled from it. That wasn't him. Had never seen himself that way. He was just a guy who'd made a mistake, a single lapse in judgment fueled by a split-second assumption. Yet the tightening in his chest told a different story, one he wasn't ready to hear. Stepping outside, the sunlight hit him like a slap, bright and unrelenting. But it offered no comfort. The warmth couldn't touch the cold knot of guilt twisting in his gut, growing tighter with every step. He squinted down the street, searching for Mr. Bennett's car, that sleek, gleaming vehicle he'd assumed couldn't possibly belong to its driver. It was gone now, vanished like a ghost, leaving behind only the echo of the scene that had unfolded. Mark pulled his phone from his pocket as he trudged toward his own car, a modest sedan parked haphazardly in the lot. His fingers scrolled through notifications, missed calls, a text from his wife. "Sarah, don't forget dinner with the Jensens tonight. See you soon." The words blurred on the screen as his mind raced back to Mr. Bennett, to the way he'd stood there, unshaken, even as the police stammered their apologies. Apologies to a man who radiated success, who'd built an empire Mark could only dream of touching. All while Mark had reduced him to a stereotype without a second thought. He slid into the driver's seat, the familiar creak of the upholstery doing little to ground him. The weight of the day pressed down harder now, a physical ache that settled into his bones. Dinner with the Jensens loomed ahead, a mundane ritual of suburban life, backyard barbecues, casual beers, the same tired small talk about golf and kids' soccer games. Doug Jensen would be there, all easy smiles and hearty laughs, oblivious to the storm raging inside Mark's head. Janice, Doug's wife, would bustle around with trays of appetizers, her chatter filling the gaps in conversation. Sarah would play her part too, nodding along, her warm laughter masking the fact that she had no idea what her husband had done just hours before. The thought of sitting through it all, of pasting on a smile while his mind replayed Mr. Bennett's words on an endless loop, felt unbearable. As he drove home, the streets of his neighborhood unfolded around him, neat rows of houses with manicured lawns, driveways lined with sensible cars, an American flag fluttering proudly in front of the Petersons' place down the block. It was a safe place, a good place, the kind of community he'd always been proud to call home. But today, it felt different. For the first time, Mark wondered about the invisible walls that divided them, alt-quiet assumptions, the snap judgments whispered behind closed doors. He pulled into his driveway, catching sight of Doug out front, clippers in hand as he sculpted his hedges into perfect squares. Doug waved, his grin wide and effortless, and Mark managed a weak wave back before killing the engine. He wasn't in the mood for Doug's usual banter, not today. Inside the car, the silence wrapped around him like a cocoon, a fleeting refuge from the chaos of his thoughts. He sat there, hands still gripping the wheel, as the full gravity of what he'd done began to sink in. Mr. Bennett hadn't just called him out, held a mirror up to Mark's soul, forcing him to see the ugliness he'd never acknowledged. Justice, Mark realized, wasn't just about laws or rules, it was about the quiet, devastating consequences of wielding power carelessly, of letting prejudice masquerade as duty. He'd judged a man for who he was, while Mr. Bennett had judged him for what he'd done, and in that exchange, Mark had lost something he wasn't sure he could ever reclaim. Dinner at the Jensens unfolded exactly as he'd feared. The long wooden table stretched out before him, laden with platters of grilled chicken and bowls of potato salad, the air thick with the scent of charred meat and Doug's booming laughter. Doug launched into a detailed retelling of his latest golf trip, his voice rising with excitement as he mimed sinking a putt. Sarah sat beside Mark, her elbow brushing his as she chuckled at all the right moments, her smile tight but practiced. Mark pushed a piece of chicken around his plate, the fork scraping against porcelain with a faint screech. His mind was miles away, back in that cafe, trapped in the moment. Mr. Bennett's eyes had met his, calm, composed, yet burning with a restrained fury that cut deeper than any shout. "I'm grabbing another beer," Mark mumbled, shoving his chair back with a scrape that made Sarah glance at him, her brow furrowing slightly. He didn't meet her gaze as he escaped to the kitchen, the cool tile under his feet a stark contrast to the heat rising in his chest. He yanked open the fridge, the blast of cold air hitting his face as he grabbed a bottle. Twisting the cap off with a sharp jerk, he stared at the amber liquid, the condensation slick against his palm. What are you going to do about it, Mr. Bennett hadn't said it aloud, but the question hung there in the memory of his expression, demanding an answer Mark didn't have. He took a long swig, the bitter taste lingering on his tongue, and leaned against the counter. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, but it couldn't drown out the truth. He'd abused a power he didn't even realize he held, and the consequences had carved a wound that wouldn't heal easily. Back in the dining room, Doug's voice carried on, oblivious to the war waging inside Mark's head. "And then I sank it right in the hole," he crowed, earning another round of laughter. Sarah nudged Mark again, her voice soft but insistent. "Isn't that something?" she said, her eyes searching his face. He nodded, a hollow gesture, but all he could see was Mr. Bennetcio, innovator, A man who'd built the very car Mark had assumed was stolen. All because his mind had leapt to the darkest conclusion. The irony twisted the knife deeper. How had he been so blind? How had he let himself fall so far without even noticing? The night wore on, the Jensens' cozy home glowing with the warmth of suburban normalcy. But Mark felt like an outsider in it all. He excused himself early, muttering something about a headache, and stepped into the cool night air. The stars blinked down at him, indifferent, as he walked the short distance back to his house. Inside, the quiet was deafening, and as he sank onto the couch, Mr. Bennett's parting words echoed once more, "Think twice." It was a lesson in justice, raw and unfiltered, a reminder that power misused could turn a man into a villain in his own story. Mark didn't know what came next how to atone, how to face the man he'd wronged, or if he even could. But one thing was certain, he'd never forget the weight of that gaze, or the truth it had forced him to see. The late afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the tiled floor where Mark stood, gripping the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He'd never thought of himself as a villain, far from it. In his mind, he was a decent man, flawed but fair, the kind of person who tried to see the good in others, who didn't leap to conclusions based on shallow things like looks. But today had ripped that comforting self-image to shreds, leaving him staring into a fractured reflection he barely recognized. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a suffocating burden he couldn't shake, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator only amplified the chaos swirling in his head. A gentle voice broke through the storm of his thoughts, soft but piercing. "You okay?" It was Sarah, standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the fading light. Her eyes, wide and searching, flickered with a mix of worry and curiosity, as if she could sense the turmoil roiling beneath his silence. Mark had always marveled at her intuition, how she could read him like an open book, even when he clamped his mouth shut. She stepped into the kitchen, her footsteps light but deliberate, and stopped beside him. Her hand found his arm, resting there with a warmth that felt both comforting and accusatory. "You've been quiet tonight," she said, her tone tender yet probing, her gaze tracing the lines of his face for answers he wasn't ready to give. "Something happened today, didn't it?" Mark's throat tightened, a lump forming as he wrestled with the urge to bury the truth. He didn't want to tell her, didn't want to peel back the layers of his shame and expose the ugliness underneath, not to Sarah, not to anyone. But the secret was a lead weight in his chest, dragging him down with every breath. "Yeah," he muttered at last, his voice rough and low, barely audible over the hum of the room. "Something did happen." He flicked his eyes toward her, catching the steady patience in her expression, and for a fleeting moment, he considered dodging the truth, brushing it off with a vague excuse. But the lie wouldn't come. He needed to say it aloud, to let the words spill out and maybe, just maybe, loosen the knot strangling his heart. "I called the police today," he began, each word a heavy stone dropping into the silence between them. He forced himself to keep going, though his voice trembled with the effort. "I thought I saw someone suspicious, a black guy driving this really nice car. It didn't seem right to me, so I made the call." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of shock passing through them, but she didn't interrupt. Her silence stretched out, taut and unnerving, more piercing than any question she could have asked. Mark pressed on, his voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "And when the cops showed up, turns out he wasn't just some random guy. He was the CEO of the car company, the owner of the damn car." Sarah's lips parted as if she meant to speak, but she held back, her breath catching in her throat. Mark could see the gears turning behind her eyes, the slow unraveling of disbelief as she processed what he'd done. The air between them grew thick, charged with the gravity of his confession. "Mark," she said at last, her voice soft but laced with something sharp, shock, disappointment. "Maybe both. You really thought he stole the car?" The question hung there, simple yet devastating, cutting straight to the heart of his failure. "I don't know what I thought," Mark admitted, frustration surging up like bile in his throat. He ran a hand through his hair, tugging at the strands as if he could pull the truth out of himself. "I saw him, and I just assumed he didn't belong here, that the car was too nice for him, that he didn't fit. I don't know why I thought it, but I did." His chest tightened, shame flooding through him like a tidal wave, drowning him in the realization of his own prejudice. He could still picture the man Marcus Bennett standing there in the parking lot, surrounded by officers, his dignity unshaken even as Mark's accusation crumbled around them. Sarah's expression softened, and she reached up, her hand brushing his cheek, forcing him to meet her gaze. "That's not like you," she said quietly, but there was a tremor of uncertainty in her voice, a crack in her conviction that stung more than outright condemnation. She wanted to believe he was better than this, and so had he. "I didn't think it was either," Mark replied, his voice breaking as the words clawed their way out. "But I did it. I made that call, and I humiliated him." Sarah right there in front of everyone. Her hand fell away, and she took a step back, her brow creasing as the full weight of his words settled over her. She stared at the floor, her fingers twisting together in a nervous dance, and Mark could feel the distance growing between them, not just physical, but emotional, a chasm carved by his own actions. After a long, agonizing pause, she spoke again. "What did he say?" Her voice was steady now, but there was an edge to it, a quiet demand for the rest of the story. Mark let out a bitter, hollow laugh, the sound scraping against the silence. He didn't have to say much. The way he looked at Mel like I was the lowest kind of persona said everything. And he was right. I was. The memory burned in his mind, Marcus's piercing gaze, calm yet searing, cutting through Mark's defenses and laying bare the ugliness he'd tried to ignore. Silence descended again, thick and oppressive, the kind that settles when words fail, and the truth sits exposed like an open wound. Sarah tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "What do you do with something like that?" she asked, her voice soft but unyielding, a challenge wrapped in compassion. "How do you fix it?" Mark shook his head, the motion slow and defeated. "I don't know if I can," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if this is something you can fix." He looked at her, searching for an answer in her face, but all he saw was a quiet resolve, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. She stepped closer again, her expression thoughtful, almost searching. "Maybe it's not about fixing it, Mark," she said, her words deliberate, sinking into him like roots into soil. "Maybe it's about understanding why it happened in the first place." Her gaze held his, steady and unflinching, and though he wanted to look away, he couldn't. She was writhe knew it deep in his bones. This wasn't a simple mistake he could erase with an apology or a good deed. It was a reckoning, a harsh light shining on the parts of himself he'd never bothered to examine. The taste of the beer he'd been sipping turned bitter on his tongue, a sharp reminder that there was no escaping this moment, no pretending it was just another ordinary evening. In the days that followed, Mark couldn't outrun the unease that clung to him like a second skin. It was there in the quiet of his morning runs, the rhythm of his footsteps echoing the thudding guilt in his chest. It lingered at work, where the hum of the office couldn't drown out the memory of Marcus Bennett's face. And it followed him to the grocery store, where every glance from a stranger felt like an accusation. The incident had lodged itself in his mind, a nagging splinter he couldn't dig out. And with it came a growing obsession with the man he'd wronged. Marcus wasn't just a name anymore, he was a symbol of everything Mark had failed to be. One gray afternoon, as Mark sat hunched over his desk, the glow of his computer screen blurring into a sea of meaningless numbers, his phone buzzed sharply against the wood. He reached for it absently, expecting a mundane distraction, an email from his boss, a reminder about his daughter's soccer practice, but what he saw stopped him cold. The headline blazed across the screen. Local CEO calls out racial profiling after false accusation. His heart plummeted, a sickening lurch that left him breathless. He didn't need to read the article to know it was about Marcus. It could only be about Marcus Bennett. His thumb tapped the link anyway, driven by a masochistic need to face the consequences. The page loaded with agonizing slowness, the office Wi-Fi stuttering as if it, too, dreaded what was coming. When the article finally appeared, Marcus Bennett's face stared back at him, calm, composed, and undeniably powerful. The story unfolded in crisp, unflinching detail. How Marcus had been accused of stealing his own car outside a cafe. How he'd stood tall through the humiliation. And how he was now turning the ordeal into a rallying cry against racial profiling. Mark's stomach twisted as he scrolled, each paragraph a fresh stab of guilt. Marcus's words leapt off the screen. This wasn't the first time. Something like this has happened to me, and I doubt it will be the last. It's not just about one incident, it's about the patterns of behavior we see in society, where people are judged by their skin color before anything else. Patterns of behavior. The phrase burrowed into Mark's mind, sharp and unrelenting. He'd always prided himself on being fair, unbelieving in equality. But here was the truth laid bare. He'd been part of that pattern, a cog in the machine of injustice, and he hadn't even seen it until now. Marcus was taking action, scheduling interviews, partnering with activists while Mark sat frozen. His name absent from the article, but his guilt screaming louder than any byline. The screen dimmed as he let the phone slip from his hand, the weight of it all crashing back into him. Mark, the voice jolted him back to the present. He turned to see Ellen, his co-worker, leaning against the doorframe of his office, her sharp eyes softened with concern. "You okay?" she asked, tilting her head as she studied him. "You've been out of it lately." Mark forced a smile, but it felt brittle, a mask that wouldn't hold. "Yeah, I'm fine," he lied, the words tasting like ash. "Just a lot on my mind." Ellen's brow furrowed, skepticism flickering across her face, but she didn't press. "Well, let me know if you need anything. We've got that client call in 10 conference room." "Thanks," he said, nodding as she turned to leave. "I'll be there." But as her footsteps faded down the hall, he glanced back at his phone, the article's faint glow taunting him. How could he face Ellen, or anyone, knowing what he'd done? They didn't know, none of them did, but the secret gnawed at him. A relentless reminder that justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about consequences, about the ripple effects of power misused. And Mark was only beginning to understand the depth of his own fall. The clinking of forks against plates filled the dining room as the family sat around the table, their voices overlapping in a chorus of disbelief and frustration. They shook their heads, lamenting the unfairness that had seized their small town's attention, oblivious to the fact that the source of it all was right there, sharing their meal. Mark's stomach churned with every bite, the food tasting like ash as he forced it down, his mind replaying that haunting realization: they didn't know it was him. Days stretched into weeks, and the weight of his secret grew heavier, pressing against his ribs like a stone he couldn't dislodge. The article, bold and unapologetic, had ignited a firestorm of conversation. In the cozy booths of the cafe, sweat-soaked gym-goers between sets, even the teenage cashier at the grocery store with her chipped nail polish and tired eyes, they all talked about Marcus Bennett. They spoke of racial profiling, of a system that needed to be torn down and rebuilt, their voices rising with passion or sinking with resignation. Yet no one ever turned their gaze to Mark. He moved through his routines like a ghost, nodding at neighbors, chatting about the weather while inside he was unraveling, thread by fragile thread. Sarah saw it, of course, she always did. Her sharp eyes caught the way his hands trembled when he poured his coffee, the way his laughter never reached his face anymore. Over dinner, she'd lean in, her voice soft but insistent, asking if he wanted to talk about whatever was eating at him. Each time, he'd wave her off with a tight smile, muttering that he just needed to let it go, to move forward. But how could he? Marcus's face stared back at him from the glossy covers of local magazines stacked by the barber shop door. His name screened from headlines on every newsstand, a constant echo in Mark's ears. The world seemed to lift Marcus, appraising his resilience, his dignity, while Mark drowned in the memory of the day he'd stripped that dignity away. The guilt wasn't loud, it was a quiet, relentless gnawing, chewing through his sleep, his thoughts, his every moment of stillness. One evening, after another meal where the silence between him and Sarah stretched taut as a wire, Mark found himself alone in the living room. The TV flickered with some late-night talk show, its colors bleeding into the dimness, but his eyes couldn't focus on it. Sarah had trudged upstairs hours ago, her shoulders slumped from a long day at the office, her footsteps fading into the hum of the house. The kids, to a lanky shadow swear, holed up in their rooms, their laughter and the staccato of video game gunfire drifting faintly down the stairs. The stillness should have been a comfort, but it only amplified the storm raging inside him. His hand reached for his phone, fingers brushing its cold surface, and he hesitated. feeling the tremor in his grip. He unlocked it, scrolling through his contacts with a deliberateness that bordered on dread. There it was, Bennett, Marcus. He'd dug up the number weeks ago, late one sleepless night, through a friend of a friend who didn't ask questions. At the time, it had been enough just to have it a digital tether to his shame. But tonight, the restlessness clawed at him, demanding action. He couldn't keep carrying this alone. It was crushing him, splintering his resolve with every breath. His thumb lingered over the call button, his pulse hammering so loud it drowned out the TV's murmur. What was he even doing? Would Marcus answer? And if he did, what words could possibly bridge the chasm Mark had carved between them? Before doubt could pull him back, he pressed it. The phone rang once, a sharp jolt to his nerves, twice, his breath catching, 3 times, his hope fading. He braced for the voicemail, but then a voice cut through the static. Hello? Mark's mouth turned to sand, his tongue useless. For a heartbeat, he was paralyzed, the weight of that single word pinning him down. But he'd crossed a line now, and there was no retreating. Marcus, he croaked, his voice shaking like a leaf in a storm. It's Mark Johnson. To need to talk to you. The silence that followed was suffocating, stretching out so long Mark thought the call had dropped. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and ragged. Each exhale a plea for Marcus to say anything. His heart thudded against his chest, a frantic drumbeat counting down to judgment. Mark Johnson, Marcus said at last, his tone steady, but laced with a sharpness that cut deeper than anger. Why are you calling me? Mark swallowed, the lump in his throat nearly choking him. Wanted to apologize, he stammered, the words spilling out in a clumsy rush. For what happened that day at the cafe. I was wrong. I shouldn't have assumed anything about you. About the car. I don't even know what was going through my head. His voice cracked, raw with the guilt he'd buried for weeks. He hadn't planned this, hadn't polished his confession into something neat. All he had was the truth, messy and inadequate, and the desperate need to lay it bare. Marcus didn't respond right away, and the pause stretched Mark's nerves to the breaking point. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate, but stripped of any softness. Do you even know what you did? Mark's chest tightened, a wave of nausea rising. I do, he said, his voice barely holding together. I humiliated you. I let my biases take over. He called the police without a second thought. I assumed the worst. Just because of who you are. Marcus didn't flinch. You called the cops because I'm a black man driving a luxury car, he said, his words blunt as a hammer. You didn't think I belonged there. You looked at me and saw a criminal. The starkness of it hit Mark like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He'd rehearsed this moment in his head, but hearing Marcus say it aloud stripped away any shield he'd built. I was wrong, he whispered, eyes stinging. I see that now. Do you? Marcus's voice carried a skeptical edge, piercing through Mark's fragile resolve. Because it's not enough to just see it. You caused harm. I've dealt with people like you my whole life, people who don't even realize they're the problem. Mark shut his eyes, the weight of those words pressing down until he could barely breathe. I want to fix it, he said, his voice small, almost lost in the quiet. I want to make it right. Marcus's reply was swift, sharp as a blade. How do you fix years of systemic racism? You think an apology wipes that away? Mark froze, his breath hitching. He had no answer, no grand plan, just a hollow ache, and the dawning truth that his regret might never be enough. I don't know, he admitted, voice breaking. I don't know how to fix it, but I'm willing to learn. I don't want to be that person anymore. Another long silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken history. Mark could hear Marcus breathing, could almost feel the man's exhaustion, his weariness. Through the phone, you need to understand something, Marcus said at last, his tone softer, but still resolute. What you did with people like you do every day, it's not just about me. It's about my son, watching me get questioned for no reason. It's about my nephews, growing up scared of every siren. It's about my friends, who've been followed in stores since they were kids. It's about every black person who's told over and over that they don't belong. Mark's throat burned, tears welling as Marcus's words painted a picture he'd never fully seen. I get that now, he said, voice trembling. I didn't before, but I do now. Then do something about it, Marcus shot back, firm and unyielding. This can't just be about your guilt, Mark. It has to be about change. Mark nodded, though Marcus couldn't see it, a silent vow forming in the gesture. I will. He promised, the words tasting like a lifeline. I will. Marcus paused again, and when he spoke, the anger had ebbed, replaced by a guarded weariness. I don't need your apology, Mark. What I need is for you to do better, be better. And that's not something you fix with one call. The truth of it sank deep, shattering Mark's naive hope that this conversation might absolve him. It wasn't about his comfort. It was about a reckoning far bigger than himself. I understand, he said quietly. I know it's not enough, but I'm going to work on it. I don't want to be the kind of man who hurts people like that. I want to change. Then start now. Marcus replied, simple and direct. Start by learning. Start by listening. Stop looking for a quick fix to feel better without doing the work. Mark nodded again, the weight settling into something solid, something he could carry. Thank you, he whispered, though he knew Marcus didn't want his gratitude. The call ended without ceremonial goodbyes, just a faint click of disconnection. Mark sat there, phone still clutched in his hand, staring into the dark as the silence swallowed him. It hadn't gone as he'd hoped. There was no forgiveness, no neat resolution to lighten his load. But maybe that was the lesson. He didn't deserve it yet. Justice wasn't a gift handed out, it was earned, step by painful step, and he'd only just begun. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Mark sat at his laptop, the cursor blinking accusingly on a blank search bar. His coffee sat untouched, steam curling into the air, as he wrestled with where to start. Finally, with a slow, deliberate breath, he typed, how to become an ally in the fight against racial injustice. The screen filled with links, articles, videos, voices he'd never sought out before, and he dove in. Over the next few days, he pored over stories of prejudice, watched documentaries that made his stomach twist, listened to people who'd lived what he'd only glimpsed. It was hard, peeling back layers of ignorance he hadn't known he carried, but it was necessary. He went to a community meeting on diversity, standing awkwardly at the back, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet resolve to hear. A woman with gray streaks in her hair spoke of being trailed in stores. A young man recounted the dread of flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Their words weren't just stories, they were mirrors, reflecting Mark's role in a system he'd never questioned. Weeks later, at a community event on racial equality, Mark saw Marcus again. The man stood at the podium, his voice steady and commanding, speaking to a crowd that hung on his every word. Mark lingered near the exit, hands shoved deep in his pockets, not expecting a glance or a nod. He wasn't there for recognition. He was there to absorb the lessons Marcus and others offered, to confront the consequences of power misused. The road ahead was long, lined with mistakes he couldn't erase, but for the first time, he felt the stirrings of purpose. Change wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And maybe, just maybe, this was enough to start.